Well, it's the political equivalent to me and the others watching this election, about 260 million people, of Christmas Eve. This is a crackling night. There's going to be some victory tonight, perhaps, and there's going to be some defeat tonight, maybe some concessions tonight, maybe early tomorrow morning. But it's all going to happen right here tonight at Democracy Plaza at Rockefeller Center. MSNBC is covering from right here. What an exciting location. I'm joined by an old friend and a supreme pro, Andrea Mitchell, by Ron Reagan, a new friend relatively, by an old pro, another one, I'm sorry, a youthful, wonderful guy, Willie Brown, who knows California politics and has never been beaten, and Joe Scarborough, a man who understands one of the more interesting states better than anybody here. Let's start with Andrea. It's going to be a long evening. Everybody indicates, everybody thinks about. There's been exit polls and all that we can't even talk about, but they give some indication. But looking at everything for the last couple weeks, what's going to tell you tonight who's going to win?
Voter turnout. I think by everyone's admission, if there is a big voter turnout and if young people vote, then it would benefit John Kerry over George Bush. If the voter turnout goes upwards of 112 to 115 million, over 115 million, both sides I think would tell you that.
That's the break point.
That's pretty much the break point, because it was 105 million 4 years ago. Then you have to add normal population growth. 110 million would be the equivalent race. So if it's upwards of 115 million. But then you look at the battleground states. And in those states, we've got some states that have been so close all along. We don't know how those will turn out. We don't know how many people are voting after 5 o'clock, which tend to be Democratic voters, workers who get off shift. So you don't know what the breakdown is between men, women, young and old. But if the young people vote, and if the cities turn out, if the African-American vote and other minority votes turn out for John Kerry, we're going to be looking at Kentucky, for instance, some of those 7 o'clock closing states. What happens at 7 o'clock is we'll see some very big Bush states, should be very strong Bush states, which are closing, which are South Carolina and Georgia and Virginia. Kentucky. And when you look at those states, how is Bush doing in those states? Is he holding his own? Is he doing well in Virginia? If he's not doing well in Virginia, if John Kerry is beginning to edge into what should be a Bush vote, if he's doing well in the suburbs, Kerry, then you begin to think that maybe this is a Kerry kind of night. In Kentucky, as we referred to earlier, there is that Senate race. You heard Keith Olbermann talking about that. That Senate race between the incumbent Jim Bunning and Dan Mangiardo, the challenger. If Jim Bunning, who lost a big lead in the early polling a couple of weeks ago, if he's doing well, then that's pretty good for the Senate, for the Republicans.
Ron Reagan, do you agree with the young voter being the critical factor here?
Yeah, many young voters, of course, newly registered. They're doubtless being challenged in some polling places. But Andrea is exactly right. It's turnout. And now these first states, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, Virginia, South Carolina in particular, we know how they're going to go. We know that Bush will almost certainly win those states. But what's the margin in those states? In Virginia, for instance, is it close? Is Kerry closing in? Vermont, of course, is going to go to Kerry. He's a neighbor boy there, and he'll take that. But again, what are the margins? It's not until a little later in the evening that we'll hit those really critical states like Ohio, Florida, and of course Pennsylvania is in that mix too, I guess.
Let's get a different view with Joe Scarborough.
But in those subsets, some of those states, some of those conservative states, Georgia, like you're talking about, with evangelicals, very interesting. I'm just as interested to see how some of the more conservative rock-ribbed Republican areas turn out. This election could turn out like 1992. It could turn out like 1994, where you had a lot of right-wing conservatives come out electing right-wing people like me. I just got a note passed to me. Pensacola Christian College, Precinct 110 in Escambia County, Florida. 3.5 to 4 hour waits. They just ran out of ballots down there. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you there's a level of intensity on both sides. The question is, though, again, this goes back to what Karl Rove wanted to figure out day one. How do you get 4, 5, 6 million evangelicals to the polls? So let's look at Virginia. Let's see how George Bush does there. If George Bush wins by a couple points in Virginia and he doesn't carry these conservative areas as well as he should have, it could be a long night for him. They've got to get people excited. Not just in the states that, like Florida, that they carry. I mean, we're going to learn a lot at 7 o'clock.
So this is a battle between the culturally conservative people in the country that don't always vote, and young people who may have a problem with the war in Iraq who don't always vote, never voted before. That's the battle.
Well, I think it is blue state versus red state, as we've always said. I always talk about fly over space, but they're cultural values. It's just like, you know, Pennsylvania is such a wonderful state because it's about 3 or 4 different states. You look at Pennsylvania, it's really a blue state when you're in Philadelphia, but as you start moving west,
Right, I know.
it starts turning into a red state. And
you know, you can tell that growing up. The jukeboxes would change.
Yeah.
They'd go from pop music in Philly to country western in Reading.
Right.
And it was amazing as a kid to discover that.
So we try to oversimplify, but that really is where this all breaks
Right.
down. Are the red states, like they did in 1994, going to rise up and say, hey, we're going to support the guy? The NBC poll, again, says 97% of Republicans support George W. Bush tonight. That may be his best chance.
Mr. Mayor.
Well, if 97% supports him, I think you'd better reevaluate whether or not you can win with just Republican votes. That may not be enough in that 97%. I think we ought to look for some additional keys that we haven't focused on at all. And that's what will happen to the libertarians. How do they operate? Will they be the Nader factor with reference to George Bush that Nader was to Al Gore? And I think there's a distinct possibility. In some of the states, in fact, in Nevada, in New Mexico, in Wisconsin, in Arizona, they put a ton of money into television in the last 10 days, and there have been a few stories about it, but nobody has checked it out. You go back and compare it to 4 years ago, you'll notice where in the states in which, like New Mexico, in which Mr. Gore won, the Libertarian got more votes than Mr. Gore won by, which means the Libertarian had an effect on George Bush's efforts.
Is this the old Perot vote, waiting to find a home?
Well, I think you could call it that.
Right.
I think you could call it that, but not with Perot money, but with a sufficient amount where we ought to pay some attention because, after all, Nader is already history.
Let's go right now to Pat Buchanan. He's part of our opinion panel. He's also joining us here at the Democracy Plaza. And Dee Dee Myers, I see her joining us too. Dee Dee, you first. You're watching. You're looking at the tea leaves tonight at 7 o'clock. We've got 6 states to call, and then the big one, Ohio, at 7:30. What are you looking for?
Well, at 7 o'clock, I think a couple of things. Again, to repeat some of the things other people said, the margin, particularly in Virginia, which will be the closest of the states that President Bush is expected to win. If it's close, if it's too close to call in the early hours, that may portend very well for Senator Kerry. I also think that the Senate race in Kentucky is interesting, not just in and of itself, but I'm wondering if maybe there's a little bit of an anti-incumbent thing working out in the country tonight. There seems to be a lot of energy for change. We'll see how that pans out, but we'll be looking at the Bunning race as perhaps an indicator of that. In Ohio, not only will we be looking at Cuyahoga County, which is a traditional Democratic area, but there's a couple of swing counties, Stark County and Montgomery County, which tend to be bellwethers. President Clinton won them both in 1996. President Bush won Stark County in 2000. How will those go? That'll be very interesting. And of course, in Florida, we're looking at the I-4 corridor, which goes up the middle of the state, where there's a lot of new voters there. It may cut into the president's lead in the northern part of the state. So I'll be looking closely for numbers there, as well as the rest of that state.
Okay, Patrick, what are you looking at? What do you see in your big eye and big history bringing into this campaign?
Well, I'll tell you, Chris, I took a nap after I did IMUS this morning, and when I initially got up, the Dow Jones was in very healthy shape, about 80 points up, and the NASDAQ was rising. A couple hours later, after a sandwich, the whole thing had gone wobbly. I think some of the nervousness that maybe the folks see at the White House, obviously the investor community saw. I agree with the folks who say, take a look at the margins in those southern states which are going to go for Bush at 7 o'clock. But if the voters are coming out of northern Virginia, that means one thing. If they're coming out of central southern Virginia, another. Of course, northern Virginia, where I live, is more heavily or more evenly Democratic. But Chris, it all comes down, I don't care, talk about turnout, minority vote, women voters, how long the lines are. If Bush holds Ohio and Florida, which are dead even on all the pre-election polls, if he holds those two, it is hard to see how Kerry gets uphill and wins. I don't care if he wins the popular vote. If Bush loses both of those, he's gone. If he loses one, then we are in the Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, New Mexico bin, if you will, and the president would have to make up about 10 electoral votes there. So I think Ohio and Florida and Pennsylvania, which we'll know at 8 o'clock, and we may be out of here earlier than you think.
Why did you suggest in your commentary there that there's a possibility that John Kerry would win the popular vote but lose the electoral? What made you say that?
Because the long lines, the energy, the talk of good turnouts in California and New York, heavy carry states. As I mentioned the other night, Chris, if you take Illinois, New York, and California, 3 of the 4, I believe 3 of the 5 largest states, they're going to go overwhelmingly for Kerry, but they're blue states. And so you can win huge popular votes there, and it doesn't help you win the election. Whereas I think in some of these other states, if the president wins these 2 other big states, Ohio and Florida, very narrowly, in the 5 big ones, he might have lost hugely in the popular vote, but he might still be the next president of the United States.
Well, maybe about 2 o'clock this morning, we're all going to be wrangling about the same kind of sets of numbers you're so far ahead of us on. But look, I'm going to come back with Andrew and everyone else after this break. Our big thought tonight and the moments ahead is looking at that first real sample of the election tonight, a real piece of actual voting at 7 o'clock. Let's come back and talk about it, and let's get those results at 7 here on MSNBC at Democracy Plaza. We're back at Democracy Plaza. I've been thinking about this night for a long time, and of course, thinking about as the news comes in, what we can report to you and how we can give you a picture of what looks like the direction the country is taking. You know, Andrea, we're looking right now at the results we're going to get in just a few minutes from these states. Indiana, reliably Republican, right? We all agree? Reliably Republican, historically the most Republican state in the Midwest. Kentucky, Jim Bunning. I grew up rooting for this guy. He won 100 games in the National League, 100 games in the American League. He was a Philly. He was an All-American, rather a Hall of Famer.
No-hitter in 1964.
An amazing guy who's been saying some strange things lately, such as, these aren't partisan comments, they're kind of odd comments. I haven't read a newspaper in 6 weeks. I have been watching Fox News, but I have no idea what you're talking about when this news item came up of American reservists resisting orders. That race will be interesting to tell, because if he wins, it shows the power of the Republican Party in Kentucky and probably the president's party. Georgia, that's the state the president will probably get. Inez Tannenbaum, she looks so good in those national debates. I mean, on Tim Russerd's show. Does she have a prayer down there, do you think?
You know, I think it's such a Republican state. I think DeMint wins that. You know DeMint, don't you? Yeah, I know DeMint. I served with him. I also served with Bunning. Bunning was just a grouchy old guy, even back when I served with him. I loved him, but he was just a sort of a grouch. I'll tell you.
My theory about Jim Bunning, I think that the sports writers got him so angry years ago. He just hates the press, hated the press from the minute he walked into the House of Representatives. And
is that your theory?
As an old sports guy.
Yeah, I think so. But I'll tell you, a race that I'm looking at is the Indiana governor's race, where you have Mitch Daniels, who actually worked for George Bush, running for governor. I want to see how he does in a conservative state.
I think you got to go back to Inez Tannenbaum, though. In spite of the fact that that's a Republican state, she has consistently won as the commissioner of education for that state. She is perceived as not really being a Democrat. She said, I will represent and organize with the Democrats, but only for the benefit of my state. Otherwise, most of my actions, George Bush. She sounded like she was the Bush candidate.
She ran away from John Kerry.
Absolutely. So this woman may very well upset the apple cart.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. I mean, it's so hard for her. I mean, and it's really unfair to judge her ability as a candidate as a female losing in South Carolina in a Senate race. It certainly has always been, as we all know, a firewall for the Republican establishment in primaries, and I think we'll probably see the same thing tonight.
You know, one thing you could be able to determine, though, from Georgia, South Carolina, is the level of enthusiasm for John Kerry of the African-American vote. Are the urban areas turning out? So that is a key thing that we ought to be looking for.
I love the Virginia discussion, by the way, because we all of us who work in Washington or spend time there know that Northern Virginia is not really the southern state. It's very much a sort of a middle Atlantic state. Northern Virginia, highly educated, a lot of government employees, a lot of military people. But you do wonder when the Democrats are going to crack that in a presidential campaign. And some people thought a few months ago, you know, just like they were talking about the Republicans were going to crack New Jersey, they talked about the Democrats. You're smiling because neither are probably going to happen. But it is interesting which states are about to change.
But you certainly would think, would you not, that Democrats would have a better chance of cracking Virginia than Republicans New Jersey, again, just because of northern because of Northern Virginia. I mean, it probably won't happen this time, but you have a fairly moderate to conservative Democratic governor in Virginia who positioned himself wonderfully in the last campaign.
I think you look at margins of 10% in some of these states. I mean,
Right.
Bush should win by 10% or more in Georgia and in Indiana. If it's much below that, then I think you say advantage Kerry.
Mark Warner, the governor of Virginia, pleaded with John Kerry not to pull money out of Virginia, Democratic money, and they did pull down their advertising budget, and otherwise maybe it would have been closer.
We're trying to read a lot into a little now because it's early in the evening. It's sort of like the Academy Awards when you're waiting to do supporting actor or some supporting actress. Let's go. I've got to go to Pat Buchanan. He feels he's off stage now, and Dee Dee Myers. Your own thoughts. Again, your second shot at the early returns. What do you make of them? What should we see here? First, Dee Dee.
Well, I think the high turnout rate is fascinating, and we'll continue to watch that, obviously. 1 in 7 voters appears to be a new voter. We're going to look at how those people vote throughout the night. I also think it's an interesting way to compare the strategies of the two campaigns. The Kerry campaign set out to reach into the middle a little bit to drive up turnout in the base, and also among independents. And obviously, Karl Rove's strategy was to drive it up among the evangelicals. So we'll be watching to see if there is increased turnout among the evangelicals. But one of the great sort of areas that's going to be examined over the coming days is how well the 527s did in achieving their objectives. They set out to register voters and turn them out. They spent a lot of money. They built big organizations on the ground in places like Ohio and Florida. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how that all plays itself out. Also, in Ohio, we haven't mentioned yet tonight, there is that ballot initiative which would ban gay marriage, State Initiative 1. And we'll be watching closely to see what the margins are in that initiative and how well, because clearly voters who turn out and vote for that will help President Bush almost certainly.
Let me go right now to Mark Potter. Pat, we'll get back to you in just a minute. Let's go to Mark Potter, who's in Central Florida with some big news about turnout. Mark.
Well, in the important political swing counties in Central Florida, they have been reporting a large turnout. Even though the polls are about to close in a few minutes, they're saying that at many of the precincts there are long lines and it could take several more hours to get everyone to the machines before they officially close down those offices. Here in Hillsborough County, the prediction is for an 80% turnout, and it may take another 2 hours, as I said, to get all those people inside. Here at the Election Tabulation Center, you can see they're just getting ready to start the count in a few minutes. This area that you're looking at right now is where they're going to be processing the absentee ballots and the early voting totals. Officials say that they could have 25% of the entire county vote tabulated within this hour, and that's because so many people here voted early. 1 in 4 voters went to the polls before the official election day, 160,000 people in this county alone. So we think we're going to start seeing numbers here, and despite those numbers, they say that there were very few problems out there, and the problems that they saw were minor. Back to you.
Any sense more of the Mel Martinez vote down there and how it's going, Mark?
There is no sense of it. Everybody has been saying it's too close to call. Of course, in this area, he's in Orlando. Betty Castor, his opponent, is here in Tampa. They're watching it very closely. Again, another important race along this famed I-4 corridor, but no one can say with any certainty at all. It's a pure guess as to what's going to happen there.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark Potter. Let's go back to Pat Buchanan as we approach the 7 o'clock first big tranche of returns we're going to be able to give you. Pat, what to look for in your home state, the Old Dominion?
Well, in Virginia, as I say, Chris, it's going to be diluted by Northern Virginia. We won't know where those votes came from. But I'll tell you this, you have a pure red state in South Carolina. You've got a red-hot Senate race. You've got a Republican candidate who's come out for a sales tax and also is a free trader. But that is a pure Bush state. Bush should wipe up the floor with Kerry in South Carolina. If you see Kerry in the 40s in South Carolina, I think it will be a difficult omen, especially if it's in the mid-40s, for Kerry, a difficult omen for the president going into that critical state of Ohio, quite frankly. I would look to South Carolina. It's about as pure as they come.
Let me go back right now to our panel, to Andrea. We're getting close here now. I thought it was interesting as we went to Florida, the Mel Martinez race. There's a fella, Cuban-American, who the president said, please leave my cabinet and go run for the Senate in Florida. I want that seat. So in a way, he's kind of a viceroy. He's a representative of President Bush, right?
He is, and the calculus was, of course, that having a Cuban-American candidate for the U.S. Senate seat would bring not only Cuban American votes, which are traditionally Republican votes, but also other Hispanic votes, Puerto Rican votes, Dominican Republican votes out, and bring that vote over to the presidential race that they wouldn't ticket split and have a big turnout for George Bush. Now, the irony is that there might be some division among Cuban American voters because there was a July crackdown on the embargoes preventing Cuban Americans from going back to Havana with money and seeing family.
And that's another generational issue.
It's another generational issue, and it could have backfired.
Younger Cuban Americans who are maybe 2 or 3 generations into this country want to have relationships with the people on the island.
There's also a demographic split also in the Hispanic community in Florida. It used to be that Orange County, where Orlando was, always went Republican. A lot of Puerto Ricans have begun moving into Central Florida, especially around that area, working in service community type jobs. Mel Martinez, of course, is a Cuban American supposed to help in South Florida, but also I suspect the Bush White House was hoping that since he's from Orlando, he would also help out with Hispanics in Central Florida as well. We'll just have to wait and see if that happened. But they elbowed a lot of people out of the way to get Mel Martinez, a trial lawyer, which I love the irony, get Mel Martinez as their candidate at the top of that ticket to help George Bush out in Florida.
It's a very close race.
It is so
Hispanic
tough.
vote, as he said, is much more complicated in Florida than it used to be. It used to be
more
Cubans, and that was it.
Well, and as Chris said also, it's so interesting, it's generational. Even 10 years ago, if you went to Cuba, you were the enemy. Now you've got a lot of young Cuban Americans who want to go to Cuba, who want to reconnect. You've got older Cuban Americans that still consider it a war against a communist regime.
Well, we're on the edge of Niagara Falls right now. The falls are about to come hurtling over, and we're all in a barrel waiting to see what's going to happen tonight, because it is one of those great presidential elections where it looks like more than ever, more people participated. We're looking at the states we're about to call here. Hopefully, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, South Carolina, Vermont, and Virginia. We're going to come up as our coverage continues right now from Democracy Plaza.
I will never relent in defending this country, whatever it takes.
I will lead the world in fighting a smarter, tougher, more strategic war on terror.
We stand for marriage and family, which are the foundations of our
We
society.
need a president who can stand up and fight for the middle class and for people struggling to get into
I
it.
will never turn over America's national security decisions to leaders of other countries.
Well, we're about to make some calls right now, and I think we were right about Virginia, talking about the closeness of the vote there, and of course the closeness for Jim Bunning, my old pitching hero, is obviously find himself in a race that's not quite clear what the result's going to be, and we're not quite ready to make these calls, but of course we do know already Virginia's closer than expected, and we do know that Bunning's race is closer than we expected. Too early to call that one, and so we're about to make a call right now in Georgia. George Bush, the President of the United States, is the projected winner in Georgia. No surprise there, but a win. The first win in the column tonight. In Indiana, President Bush, the projected winner with a strong early vote there of 58% to 42%. We've got George Bush now in Georgia and Indiana. In Kentucky, President Bush, the winner in the third state tonight to be called by NBC, the projected winner in the state of Kentucky. So we've got South Carolina and Georgia and Indiana. And now Vermont. John Kerry, the senator from Massachusetts, winning in neighboring Vermont, his first projected win, I should say, of the night. We're projecting, by the way, to make this formal. When all the votes are counted, we'll know which state. We'll be telling you which state has decided. In Virginia, of course, we have a state here that's too close to call, and that means something. It means that in the numbers that have come in so far, it's not that it's just too early. It means that the numbers are too close, which makes a statement. We were looking for a close race. We've found one. The Old Dominion, Virginia, usually a safe Republican state, having a little bit of time making up its mind tonight. In South Carolina, too early to call right down in South Carolina. That means that we don't have enough numbers, actually, to make that call down there. So we're looking now at the electoral map, and we're toting up what we can tell you right now. These are projected wins. Kerry in Vermont, 34 electoral votes for the president, 3 electoral votes for John Kerry. None of this dramatically unexpected, except those close races, starting with Virginia. Now let's look at the United States Senate races. Johnny Erickson is the projected winner. No surprise there. His Democratic opponent was very underfunded in the race. That's Johnny Isakson winning, a projected winner in Georgia. In Indiana, Evan Bayh, Right now, we haven't made a call. We are making a call. Evan Bayh is the projected. He's the Democrat, of course, winning re-election, a very popular guy there, a moderate Democrat in the state of Indiana. And now Pat Leahy, a man who's had a very sharp attitude towards the incumbent president, and of course we know the vice president. We know about that little duel at the vice president's desk in the Senate where bad words were used. Well, Pat Leahy has been, according to our projections, re-elected today in the little state of Vermont, where also the president did very well today. And as I said before, too close to call. This is very interesting. Jim Bunning, who I said was a star pitcher, a Hall of Famer in both major baseball leagues, won a very close race last time. Here he is with 19% of the vote in, finding himself in a race too close to call. That's a very big issue right now, very significant. In South Carolina, boy, this is powerful, too close to call. Inez Tenenbaum is apparently doing well enough to keep this race a bit up in the air early in the evening tonight against Jim DeMint, the U.S. congressman. That was the last of our announcements to make, our declarations. Let's go right now to Keith Olbermann for other calls. Keith.
Let's look at that change in the balance of power. As you saw, the races that we've called in the Senate so far, only one involves the change from one party to the other. Georgia doing that, and there's good news and bad news in that for the Republicans, who gained the seat with Representative Isaacson's election to make it right now, pending the rest of tonight's results. 37-31-1. If you want to look at it from a point of view of where was the Senate when we started tonight, it is now 52-47-1. But again, there are many, many still outstanding, with 34 seats up for grabs tonight. But in Georgia, whereas the Republican Representative Isaacson has beaten or will beat the Democrat Representative Majette, according to our NBC News projections, that's Zell Miller's seat. So that was a Democratic seat that acted like a Republican seat in the last couple of years anyway. So a one-swing balance of power change in the Senate thus far, but nothing so dramatic as a bona fide Democratic leader going out, as we might see in South Dakota. We're going to take a further look on that later on. Here are some early projections on the governor's races, and it's too close to call and too early to call in Indiana, with just 4% of the vote in between, as Joe Scarborough mentioned earlier, the incumbent Joe Kernan and the former OMB director Mitch Daniels. Also too early to call in Vermont, although we do have one caveat on that, between the mayor of Burlington, the Democrat Clavelle, and the incumbent Republican governor Jim Douglas. There is a 50% rule there. That is why that one is being adjudicated as too early to call. One of those 11 definition of marriage propositions is already pretty much in. This is verdict, though, is yes. It is now projected that there will be a definition of marriage, Amendment 1 rule in Kentucky defining marriage, not surprisingly, as only between a man and a woman, but was also in Kentucky would ban civil unions in Kentucky. That already projected as the first of the 11 to be decided, and in favor of the amendment that would, in essence, ban gay marriage or civil unions in the state of Kentucky. And whether or not Senator Bunning knows anything about that, we'll find that one out later on. Chris, let's go back to you in Democracy Plaza.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Let me talk about, let's go right now, by the way, to David Gregory. He's at the White House. NBC's David Gregory.
Chris, let me give you some sense of what's happening here at the White House. The president is inside the residence with family members, his parents, his daughters, some close friends, and his top political strategist, Karl Rove, inside the residence. Meanwhile, in the Roosevelt Room, just off the Oval Office, his advisors have their own campaign war room aside from the campaign headquarters. This political operation tonight, Chris, is in overdrive. Right now, there is some level of discouragement among top advisors about a recent narrowing of polls in recent days, and that's why they're kicking things into overdrive tonight. Sarah gets going on talk radio in the battleground states. Calls going out to volunteers in the battleground states to keep the vote out. That is what's most important right now as they start to watch the voting actually come in, the votes actually come in. They want to try to drive up their vote and pay extra special close attention to the margins of victory for Kerry in those areas where they know he's going to do well in states like Florida and Ohio. The president has personally been in touch with his top campaign strategists at campaign headquarters in Northern Virginia. There is a sense of agreement right now that there is a tightness in the race that they've seen before, back in 2000, and they've seen throughout the final days of this campaign. So it's tense, but this fight is on, Chris.
Let me ask you, when did the concern begin to emerge as you've been observing it at the White House?
Well, over the weekend, they initially got some internal polling that showed the race tightening in Ohio in a way that disturbed them. There were others who were on the ground there tracking it in Ohio who have grown a little bit more pessimistic in recent days. They got some disappointing internal polling out of Iowa and Wisconsin, two critical Gore states from 2000 where they were running very well, thought they'd have a good chance for victory, a potential buffer if they lost Ohio. Those two states started to narrow in their polling. At the same time, they have been pretty upbeat about Florida all along the way. So if they look at that, they just see a tightening race going into Election Day and now Election Night. It has made them nervous indeed.
What do they think at the White House about the reemergence of Osama bin Laden? I mean, that struck a lot of Americans as sort of an odd moment in our history. How did they think it affected the voting?
Well, they don't really have a sense of that. I think in the last couple of days they realized, as our poll showed, that people really weren't paying that much attention to it in terms of having it affect their vote. That most people, in fact a majority, 69% our poll showed, had made up their minds even after the convention. So there wasn't a lot of vote to move there. But nevertheless, they thought to whatever extent the campaign debate got joined on the issue of the war on terror, it was good for the president. You saw that initially, and then you saw the Kerry campaign back away from that. The president backed away from going overboard about the tape as well. So I think they saw it sort of settle down a little bit, but they certainly wanted to talk about the war on terror down the stretch.
That story that the New York Times broke a week or so before the election, is that going to be seen as a major factor should the president come up short tonight? The fact that for a week then, a media-driven story, driven by CBS and the New York Times, hitting at the heart of the president's management of the war. Will the White House take that as a media attack on them?
Well, they certainly took it as a media attack by the New York Times, and they made no bones about saying that it was an overreach, that the piece was argumentative. They fought back hard. The mere fact that they had that as a distraction in the final week or so of the campaign was not something that they wanted. They recognized that those voters who were anxious about Iraq might see it as a metaphor for the problems in the country. Nevertheless, they felt in the final days like they were able to sort of hold it off. To the extent that Iraq will be a problem for this president among voters, they think it was bigger than just that story. It was the death toll, it was a sense of chaos there. Yes, Chris.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, David. Last point, I'm trying to figure out the president's plan for this election day. He voted, obviously had to, in Crawford, and that's a very ceremonial thing for a president to vote in his hometown. But was they planning in the beginning to come back to the White House? Was this always the plan?
Yes, it's always been the plan, is my understanding. I think what you saw, though, were late ads in terms of a visit to Columbus, Ohio, to thank volunteers, get the vote out. They even wanted to do satellite interviews with 4 Florida markets to get that vote out. They were going to do them on Air Force One. In the rain in Ohio, we were on board waiting. I was traveling with him today. They had to scrub the whole plan because in the rain they couldn't hit the satellite and they had to cancel.
Okay, thank you, David Gregory at the White House. Let's go right now to Lisa Myers of NBC. She's at Bush Cheney headquarters trying to figure out, or they're trying to figure out, and she's reporting on it, what's going on with these absentee ballots. Lisa.
Hi, Chris. Well, so far they're very concerned about the timing of the counting of the absentee ballots in Florida. The Bush campaign believes it has an advantage of 150,000 to 200,000 votes over the Democrats among those who cast absentee ballots in Florida. They had heard from the supervisor in Miami-Dade County that they may not cast the Republican absentee votes there, which are at least about 98,000 votes, that they may not count them until Thursday. So the campaign is quite concerned, talked to the Secretary of State, and is trying to get that problem fixed.
Okay, let's go right now. Thank you, Lisa Myers of NBC News. Let's go right now to Dan Abrams, who's also taking a look at the legal problems regarding this campaign election count. Dan.
Well, Chris, earlier a lot of the legal wrangling was focused on how the voting would take place. That's now taking a backseat to how the votes will be counted. And there are a number of issues that have just come up really in the last hour. In Pennsylvania, considered certainly a swing state here, the Secretary of State, a Democrat there, has ordered that 2 polling places in Lackawanna City, Pennsylvania, be kept open an extra 40 minutes and 67 minutes. That certainly will cause some controversy. We don't know exactly why that order is in place, but it is. We'll certainly continue to follow that. Also, the issue of absentee ballots in Philadelphia. A judge has essentially ordered that no one start counting the tens of thousands of absentee ballots in the Philadelphia area A GOP is concerned that there were some irregularities, and the judge saying he wants to hold a hearing at 9:30 tomorrow morning, so those votes will not be counted for now. Also, in the state of Ohio, another very important swing state, a citizen has filed a lawsuit in federal court saying that they need to establish a standard for the provisional ballots. Remember, those are the ballots where someone comes in, they say, look, I'm supposed to be on the voter roll. I don't know why I'm not there. This voter is saying, look, Bush v. Gore mandated that you have to have a consistent standard in place. How are we going to decide which votes are counted and which ones aren't? This person going to court and saying that the Secretary of State should be forced to have a consistent standard. Chris?
Okay, thank you very much, Dan Abrams. Let's go back right now to the panel here, and a very large panel, and talk. John Funda's joined us across the street. John, this problem in Cuyahoga County, we talked about it before. The problems in Philadelphia are historic. They go on. Do you think that this is the kind of thing that's going to hector our political process for cycles to come? We can't get an election because there's just too many states that have too many problems.
Well, I think Florida 2000 was a Rubicon, Chris. I think we crossed the line between just having the election end on election night and possibly it going on for election week or election month if the margin of victory of the winning candidate is not within the margin of litigation. That's the issue. And as long as it's close, you have 10,000 lawyers for Kerry, 4,000 lawyers for Bush. Lawyers litigate. That's what they're trained to do. And I think that we have a danger if, for the second election in a row, if the election is taken away from the voters and put partially in the courts, I think cynicism and I think despair about whether elections are meaningful will only increase dramatically.
Let me go right now to Mayor Brown. This problem of voter morale, I think, is serious. I mean, if you go out and wait for 3 hours, then you're told at midnight, and you stay up like you're watching, again, the Academy Awards, and it's getting a little tiring. You go to bed and you're reading the papers and you watch the Today Show or whatever, and you say, darn it, I voted. How come we don't have a president? Is this going to demoralize the people?
I don't think so. I think for the people, for the first time, great numbers of people are participating, and I think they will, however, ask questions. How is it that the standard, let's say in California, seems to be different from the standard in Ohio or Florida? Why can't we get one consistent process? I have an ATM card. I can use my ATM card in New York, Hong Kong. I can use my ATM card all over the world. It's clear that the voting process ought to at least match the ATM, and people are going to demand that of those of us who are the politicians making those decisions.
Okay, we're going to come right back and talk more about it. We got big result coming in from Ohio. We hope we get a clear result there. We'll wait and see. Ohio, the first big battleground state to report tonight, coming up in 15 minutes. Back with our panel and everyone else at NBC, working with MSNBC tonight at Democracy Plaza at Rockefeller Center. Something rather dramatic now. Look at that building. That's 30 Rockefeller Center here in New York, the head of NBC News and all of NBC, I should say, overlooking the skating rink. And we're watching the electoral vote tally as it climbs up the wall there. And don't be fooled. It's going to apparently be a much closer election than these numbers suggest. But we've got 3 votes from Vermont for John Kerry and the other votes, of course, for the president. We're also, if you look down on the ice there, where everybody likes to come and watch the beautiful skaters because they are pros, some of these people here. You're watching the emergence of our electoral map. You're seeing it being colored in. The red state's there, of course, for the president, and the blue state up there, Vermont, of course, little old Vermont for John Kerry. But stay tuned. This is going to be a very close election. By the way, let's take a look at something that's kind of a novelty. Let's go look at the headquarters now of the Bush-Cheney War Room, so-called, and we're taking a look at there. There's a shot where they're quiet, intent. Look at these people. It looks like a vote count. They're all watching to see how their campaign effort is going out. They're giving advice to people, of course, in terms of continuous efforts to try to get the Republican vote out tonight. Andrea.
Well, one of the things that David Gregory was pointing out is that what they're doing is calling people from the Roosevelt Room of the White House and trying to get people to report in to get to the polls. They're trying to produce their vote right now. Also, on the other side of the coin, we've got a report from Tom Lamas from MSNBC, who is with the Edwards campaign. And John Edwards has held on his airplane in Orlando rather than flying up to Boston to rejoin John Kerry. He's in Orlando on the phone making calls to radio stations in North Carolina, trying to rally the vote for Erskine Bowles, their Senate candidate there, because that race is apparently so tight.
Chris, listen to this. I mean, it's amazing. It reminds me of 2000 the governor of Florida at 6 o'clock called a local radio station in Pensacola. It's called the Luke McCoy Show. And the governor told people to get out and start voting, that Florida was going to be closer than they could ever imagine. And people literally, again, started going out there. A lot of people learned from 2000 that those last second pitches made all the difference in the world in Florida, and now we're seeing it repeated in state after
state. So you're to tell me,
after
Joe,
state.
there are actually people, and Andrea, who are sitting home all day during the most important election of their lifetime, and they get goosed about, 10 minutes before closing time, and they say, okay, I guess I will vote. I mean, who are these people?
I'll tell you who these people are. These people are a single mother who woke up in the morning, their kid may have been sick, and they had to take them to daycare, and then when they had to come home early, threw up all over them, so they can't do something. I mean, you know what? There are a lot of people out there that don't think, live and breathe politics 24 hours a day who really care.
Why do they go when they're called then?
Because again, it's just that final push. Sometimes you learn, especially if they're called by somebody that you know, that final push, and they say, maybe my next door neighbor can take care of my baby girl, and I'll go down and I'll cast a vote that's going to make a difference in her life.
You've been involved in these polling operations.
Yeah, Chris, and you will recall this. In 1980, when Jimmy Carter was going down to defeat, out in California, the word came forth about 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We ended up losing a couple of congressional seats because Democrats proceeded to stay at home when they were not told, you got it.
Yeah, right.
You still need to go. And so now, no party, neither of the parties will take the chance. They literally put their big guns on the horn for the very last minute, no matter what the circumstances.
Think about how slim these margins are. You got 10.3 or so registered voters in Florida, and the margin last time was 537 votes. If you can goose just a fraction of 1%, that could be the difference.
And that's when all of a sudden having a guy who may be the next vice president of the United States picking up the phone and making a phone call in North Carolina could make a real difference.
Yes. We should also point out that when you talk about a long night, some of the smart people at NBC check back. Last time around, 4 years ago, at 6 in the morning, they still had not counted 3% of the raw vote in Ohio. If Ohio is close, that's why this is going to be a long night. It takes that long to count the vote.
Yeah. It's amazing all the money spent on television advertisement. I mean, millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions, and in the end it becomes a retail campaign. It's like calling it, would you buy my Fuller brush, please? I'd really like you to come over to my gas station and buy some gas.
It's pretty old is new again.
It's pretty primitive. Let's go. Let's get Didi and Pat. Pat, join us. This kind of polling operation at the last minute is kind of stirring in a way. It shows that individual votes matter.
Well, I think it does, Chris. It certainly does. I think the story Joe told just now is critical. After Florida, I think everyone, but especially in those swing states, and of course, I think by now they all know this. I mean, we've covered this wall to wall for close to a year. I think this country, especially in the battleground states, is really attuned to the importance of it.
Okay, let's talk about the election right now. We've got an intense set of reports coming up right now at 23 after the hour. Brian Williams is going to come. We'll be having in a moment. We're going to hear from Brian Williams. Now, you know that one thing people are learning over these election cycles is that in addition to the actual polling, the networks do a lot of interviewing of people as they vote during the day to try to find out so that the next day they can report in the newspapers. This is the primary purpose of it, and on the networks. What were people thinking? What were the messages they're trying to send? For example, where do people stand on the importance of terrorism? Where do they stand on the issue of whether we should have gone to war with Iraq? Where do people stand on abortion rights? How are women voting compared to men? Is there still a gender gap? And those are the kinds of things that Brian Williams of NBC News has his hands on right now. Let's go to Brian. Brian, what are you learning so far from the exit polls tonight?
And Chris, don't forget the history books that you and I love. They will be filled with all this data when they're printed. Here in our tracking center, we are right now looking at the very basic question: what's the mood of the electorate this year? It's been as close as an election can get all along. We know that. And some of the first numbers we're getting now from our NBC News exit poll are bearing that out in terms of how President Bush is handling his job and about the direction of the nation in general. On the crucial, is the nation headed in the right direction or on the wrong track question, 50% of the voters think the nation is on the wrong track. while 47% think we are headed in the right direction. Now, 4 years ago, we hasten to add, the mood was much brighter, with 2/3 saying they were pleased with the direction of the nation, given the Clinton economy and pre-9/11. As for President Bush's job approval, voters are still very closely divided on this. The president does make it above the halfway mark, and not all surveys lately have put him there. He just barely makes it 51, 47 disapproving of the president's job performance overall. One last note on the big red state, blue state partisan divide on the president's job performance. It's about as wide as it could possibly be. One pollster said it was as sharply divided as it has been since the start of modern day polling. 92% of Republicans give the president approval, a thumbs up, while 84% of Democrats give him a thumbs down. That's why they're red, that's why they're blue, and Chris will keep going through the numbers here tonight.
Thank you very much, Brian Williams. We will be back with you throughout the evening. Let's go right now to David Schuster, who's in all-important Miami, Florida. David.
Well, Chris, while the polls in most of Florida have closed, of course, they're still open in the Panhandle, but both parties at this moment now saying that in South Florida, where there's so much chaos 4 years ago, the election today has been clean, and they have now begun the process of tabulating the votes. There's a center here at the Miami-Dade election office where they actually are waiting for the cartridges from the e-voting machines to be called in. There you can see some of the officials moving into the office where they will start the process of counting the votes. Again, a clean election here in South Florida. Chris?
Okay, thank you very much, David Schuster. We're about to have here at MSNBC headquarters about the biggest news to announce this early in the evening, and that is the results coming out of Ohio. There's three possibilities. We could call it too close to call, too early to call, or we could give you an NBC projection as to who's going to win the state of Ohio. It's a very hot announcement. Stay with us. We're going to come right back with Ohio. We're about to make an announcement in just a few minutes about Ohio, the Buckeye State, which is playing such an enormous role in this campaign. It's sort of the Florida of the year 2004 election so far. Let's go to Pat Buchanan. Pat, give me a short estimate of the importance of Ohio in this election.
Well, let's do this, Chris. If the president loses Ohio, he goes from 278 electoral votes back to 258. He'll need 12 votes to get up to 270. He can do it with Iowa and New Mexico. But it means he can't lose New Hampshire, and if he does, he's got to win Hawaii. So this is critical. But however, if the president is still in fighting shape in Minnesota and Wisconsin, he's got what Karl Rove would call an insurance policy. But Ohio, he can lose and win. I think it's much tougher to see how he could lose Florida and win, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Pat. We're going to have the Ohio results right now.
America shows uncertainty or weakness. In this decade, the world will drift toward tragedy.
Saddam Hussein didn't attack us. Osama bin Laden attacked us. Al-Qaeda attacked us.
First of all, what my opponent wants you to forget is that he voted to authorize the use of force and now says it's the wrong war at the wrong time at the wrong place.
Iraq was not even close to the center of the war on terror before the president invaded.
It's 7:30 in the East. Let's go right now to the states in which the polls have just closed. Ohio, North Carolina, and West Virginia. We're going to be getting the results in just a minute. Ohio is now, unfortunately, too close to call, and that is a big moment in this election process, Ron Reagan.
Really big, yeah. I mean, Pat's absolutely right. I think Bush critically needs Ohio, but of course, so does Kerry. They both need Ohio. And one thing to remember, too, when these poll numbers start to come in, most states are not simply red or blue. They're both. And it depends on what counties, what precincts are reporting first, which numbers are coming in first. So we have to be a little careful when you see 1% of the vote in.
Let's go with the other calls right now. That was Ohio, too close to call in the presidential race. In North Carolina, too close to call in the presidential race. Now that is interesting bit of information. The North Carolina vote had been expected to be a strong and early win for the president. It's not that case at all. North Carolina is too close to call, the Tar Heel state. West Virginia, well, this one is too early to call. That's a function of how many votes we have now, to count right now. No reason to conclude it's going to be close at the end of the evening, but not enough votes to count. 0% of the vote in there in West Virginia. In Virginia, we'll go back to that state, too close to call. That is significant with 1% of the vote in, but we have other indications that suggest that's going to be a close vote. The Old Dominion, surprisingly, this election has a lot of close calls right now. Virginia, too close to call, according to NBC. South Carolina, too early to call. There again, we don't have the numbers to tell you anything really as to who's leading or who's falling behind. Too early to call in South Carolina. And we're looking right now at the Electoral College. No changes. You can see the red there for the president and a little Vermont up there at the top. Georgia, of course, was solid for the president. And we have Indiana solid for the president. And we have West Virginia. Anyway, we're going to come back and talk about that. But the best, let's take a look right now at the close races in the United States Senate right now. In Ohio, George Voinovich, the former governor, the veteran politician in that state, according to our projections, will be reelected when all the votes are counted in Ohio. So that's one clear result already coming out of the Buckeye state. In North Carolina, still too close to call. That's a race that was closed. The voting stopped there just at 7:30 Eastern time in the Tar Heel state. Erskine Bowles was, of course, chief of staff to President Bill Clinton. In a very important race there, two very impressive candidates, Richard Burr and Erskine Bowles. Either man is going to be an important senator should he pull this out. Still too close to call in Kentucky, and that is very significant, with 40% of the vote in an early count and a lot of count already, 40%. And Jim Bunning, who a week or two ago, I think we can all agree, was expected to win by 10 points at least, finding himself in a real horse race with Dr. Mangiardo. Very close. It depends, of course, in that state, like it does with others, where the vote's coming in from.
That could be a city vote, not a rural vote.
South Carolina, another one. There's another heroic contest going on. Inez Tenenbaum, the Democrat, who has accepted many of the president's positions on issues such as the war, etc., in many ways doing what often Southern Democrats do, and that's accepting the leadership of the president, if it's a Republican president, on conservative issues. Let's go right now to Chris Jansing, who's in Cleveland, Ohio, one of the states that we just can't call yet. It's too close.
Yeah, nobody here is ready to call it either. I got to tell you, Chris, I've been talking to top officials in both the Kerry and the Bush campaigns here in Ohio. They've been nervous all day. They've been telling me almost consistently for 6 or 8 months now that they thought this was going to come down to the wire and it would eventually be a ground game. Now, here's what's different from 2000. Remember, this is what Democrats call the tragic mistake by Al Gore. He was down double digits, so he basically pulled out of Ohio about a month before the election. He ended up losing by just 3.6%. It taught the Democrats a lesson, but also the Republicans. What they believe is that the reason the Democrats were able to close so close and make them nervous is because they had a superior ground game. Karl Rove and Ken Mehlman were determined that was not going to happen this time around. They have worked on this for 4 straight years, and both sides told me earlier tonight that they are even surprised at the success of the ground game on both the Democratic and Republican side. That's why even in the cold, in the rain, we've seen lines of 3 to 4 hours, people waiting, not getting out of line. Both sides think they have done what they set out to do years ago here in Ohio, and as a result, this race is too close to call. Both sides right now, Chris, very nervous.
Okay, thank you, Chris Jansen. We'll be back to you time and again tonight in Cleveland, Ohio. I want to go right now to Joe Scarborough. Joe, I know it's early in the night, and we knew, we're looking at this schedule for days now, that we'd have possibly an early call in Ohio. We're not going to have one there. And we have, of course, coming up Florida and Pennsylvania in the next half hour. We've got New Mexico. Why did I say that? New Hampshire, another one that did Kerry make pick up for the president.
Which New Hampshire's a very important state. Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I think obviously for economic reasons, if this is going to be an issue, a campaign that George Bush is hurt because of economic issues, and New Hampshire would be a bellwether state. I wanted to pick up on something, though, that Chris Jansing said, because this is so interesting. We all remember when years that parties are better at getting out the vote. 1986, Jesse Jackson went across the Southeast, elected a lot of Democrats in the middle of the Reagan Revolution, put the Democrats back in charge of the Senate. 1994, you had the Republicans doing well on the ground game. What I find so fascinating about tonight is both sides are at the top of their game. And we've got Democratic operatives and Republican operatives who have been at the top of their games. The get-out-the-vote machines are as well-oiled. Nobody got caught off guard. You know, 2002, Karl Rove, George Bush shocked a lot of people with their get-out-the-vote operation, and I think prepared Democrats for 2004, understanding that you couldn't just call up your local union leader and say, hey, I need you to get guys to the polls for us. That they needed to do more than that. So now you've got these 527s going up against Karl Rove and the machine, and you have the absolute best. This is the Yankees versus the Red Sox, Game 7, and let's just hope that the right team wins.
Well, it's interesting, Mayor Brown, that is it because, I think Joe's right, but is it because both parties assumed, despite the big lead for the president at certain times and the big lead for Kerry at certain times, that this was going to be a very squeaker race, and therefore it was going to be decided not by the best TV ad or the best debate performance. It was going to be decided by these polling operations sometimes at 7 o'clock at night.
Well, the science of politicking now and doing campaign activities has grown tremendously since Jesse Jackson did his number in 1986. You're now at the stage where you can literally pinpoint every voter in the whole United States of America. You can address materials to every voter by first name.
People don't like to hear this.
I know that, but it is a reality.
But you know what's so interesting? And I still talking to friends that do campaigns, and what's still interesting is the most important thing is somebody knocking on your door, handing you a piece of literature, and say you need to get out tomorrow and vote for Senator Kerry or vote for George W. Bush. That's what's going on all over
But they
America.
know more than just where you live. They know how you think.
They know how you think. They know where your kids go to school. They know what you eat for dinner. And believe me, you have to have talented people. Karl Rove's people are talented, and the 527 people are talented. The Democrats are talented. You can't send just the old union leader. You've got to send a guy who will know that he's looking at Chris Matthews, not Joe Scarborough.
Okay, let's really scare people early this evening. We're all watching, so they really know how bad it really is. What would they know about somebody like yourself if you weren't a public figure? They'd know where you buy your clothes.
No, they would know better than that. They would probably know exactly where I go to church.
Right.
They would know where my kids go to school. Right. They would know who my friends are. They would know
How would they know that?
Because we do the research. The politicians now keep a memory bank. They really do keep a whole tally on everybody. They know if you have season tickets to the Giants baseball game, if you are seated near Ronald Reagan, who Ronald Reagan is.
Come on now. I hate to kill Hamlet in the first act, but let me tell you something. They don't know that much. They ain't that smart.
Believe me.
They ain't that smart. But I will tell you what they do know. They know how to tap.
Joe,
where you go to church, that's correct.
You're thinking congressional, you're thinking U.S. Senate. I'm talking about legislative races. The common denominator, the lowest common denominator politically in this nation would be people who run for state office, people who become a representative. And believe me, they are your retail politicians. They're almost just like mayors. They know people by first name, what church you go to, when your kid is graduating. You get a birthday card, you get a bar mitzvah card, you get attendance at funerals, you get the whole bit all year round. You get a flag day, you get a white feather day, you get everything. And believe me, all of that goes.
It's an outgrowth of marketing technology.
No question.
Same way they can sell you soda pop and anything else. Same technology.
Let me tell you,
neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, address by address.
They also know what petition you sign. They know exactly what petition you sign for an initiative that may go on the ballot. They make some conclusions from your signature on that.
So it's nice to know when you get a nice, cheerful, what you think is a spontaneous call. We know that we share your values on the issue of abortion rights, and we just wanted to let you know that the candidate shares them as well. Get out and vote.
Chris, one of the real techniques used in the early voting by both parties was having accumulated this data. Then they would know where to go to try to get the early voters that would be sure bets for their candidate and where to stay away. So it was a way of avoiding.
You don't want to disturb the enemy.
Exactly.
Let's go right now to it's Keith Oberman, who has some information about some big developments on the governor's races. Let's go down to Keith.
Chris, yeah, there are 11 open tonight, and several of them are key, and we're ready to give you likely results on 2 of them. Let's go to the boards in West Virginia, where the Secretary of State, Joe Manchin, has been projected as the winner by NBC News over the former Army colonel and businessman Monty Warner. The Democrats, who had outgoing Governor Bob Wise holding that seat, now expected to retain it under Joe Manchin in West Virginia. To North Carolina, where incumbent Governor Mike Easley will get another turn as the projection go, although obviously there's very little vote to actually base this on, at least statistically. He will beat Patrick Ballantyne, the former state senator, as Easley gets a second term in North Carolina. In Indiana, Mitch Daniels, the former OMB director, trying to unseat Joe Kernan, who took over for the late Frank O'Bannon when he passed away last year. This is too early to call, and also just 13% of the vote in, and obviously fairly tight still with Daniels statistically ahead. Too early to call in Indiana. Vermont, again, too early to call because we have a 50% rule. And Peter Clavell, the mayor of Burlington, the Democrat, trying to unseat the incumbent Republican governor, Jim Douglas. These polls closed at 7 o'clock in Vermont, but we're still calling this one too early to call. So 4 of the 11 updatable at this point. Chris, back to you at Democracy Plaza.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Let me talk to the panel about the question of Ohio. This one is going to decide a lot, isn't it? Pat isn't the only one who thinks, Pat Buchanan, this election could well ride on Ohio.
I think Tim Russert may have been the first to say that Ohio is the new Florida, and I think this year Ohio could be the new Florida because it is so critical to George W. Bush. He's got to win Ohio unless he does very well in the upper Midwest, in Iowa, Minnesota, there in Wisconsin. If he does well in those 3 states, then that would offset a loss in Ohio, especially with Florida as close as we expect and know it to be from all of the polling before Election Day, and especially with the inherent carry advantage in states like Pennsylvania.
Let's face it, everybody's been talking about Minnesota, Wisconsin for a while. I mean, Minnesota's been breaking John Kerry's way for the past week. Wisconsin still may be close, so that's why if George W. Bush loses Ohio, he's going to have to pick up New Mexico, Nevada, which is still in the undecided column. But George Bush's numbers, it appears over the past few days, have been dropping in the upper Midwest.
We're going to have to check. We'll come back, excuse me, everybody. We're going to come back after this commercial break to talk about Ohio because we're going to get lots of new information coming up at 8 o'clock from Pennsylvania. We might make a call there. And also New Hampshire. These are states that are going to really decide this election, and it's all coming up in the next few minutes. We'll be right back from Democracy Plaza. We're back at Democracy Plaza. We have a call to make in the state of West Virginia in the presidential race. Let's take a look at this one. It's a hard call. President Bush has won West Virginia, so he's winning states that he won last time. No pickup here. Andrea, a conservative state on cultural issues, on gun issues, on coal. The president campaigned there with he's now got 39 electoral votes to president. He went in there with Zell Miller, the very conservative senator who I've had some business with, I must say. I didn't really want it. From Georgia. That's a state that's getting more conservative, isn't it?
It is getting more conservative. They've got a Senator Jay Rockefeller who is one of the more liberal members of the Senate and is beloved in that state. But when it comes to voting in presidential races, it's very conservative. And I will bet you that when we look at the numbers and talk to people afterwards in the exit polls, that Zell Miller, that kind of appeal was very good for George Bush.
Wasn't the thinking, and everybody can join in this, when you selected John Edwards for running mate, when John Kerry did that and made that big decision, wasn't his plan to try to pick up some of those border states, not just North Carolina, but perhaps West Virginia, perhaps Missouri?
I think the plan was the Midwest. The plan was jobs and the economy.
But why John Edwards then?
John Edwards, because he was the Two America candidate, because he was going to appeal to Michigan, Ohio.
It was also a broader question of energy nationally. He was such an effective campaigner during that time.
Wouldn't Dick that part have made more sense if you were trying to win Ohio and Missouri and Iowa?
If I could dissent, it used to be that we would pick our candidates because of states. Now you have blue state candidates picking red state candidates. John Edwards was going to be the red state candidate. Remember, they took him around to all of the small towns.
Right.
He'd sit on the front porch, I'm one of you, and kind of, hey, y'all. He had the kids, and so
has he been successful in any state so far tonight? You can expect he will.
Well, you know what? North Carolina is still too close to call.
Good point.
So I think again, I mean, so many people sort of scoffed. Republicans scoffed when John Edwards was first elected. They said why he couldn't even win his own state if he were running for Senate for re-election. Well, tonight we see that Virginia's still too close to call. I mean, North Carolina's still too close to call. I suspect in the end, George W. Bush will win that race. But at the same time, it is balancing a blue ticket with a red ticket member.
I think John Edwards was also selected because you wanted something fresh and something new in the world of politics nationally. You wanted young people to see that there would be opportunities. There is an opportunity. John Edwards does not embody any of being inside of the Beltway. He's from outside of the Beltway, so to speak. He's young, vibrant, and really a part of the hip generation, at least by perception. John Edwards was selected to show that this is a fresh new day and he represented change.
But let's go right now. He don't play in West Virginia, though.
Pardon me?
I said, but he don't play in West Virginia.
Why not?
Well, you look at him. He just doesn't play in West Virginia.
He's not rough looking enough?
He's not. You know what? They'd rather hang out with W shooting guns.
He's got the Brett girl problem.
It's the Brett girl.
Born in South Carolina.
Let's go right now to Roz Jordan, who's in my home city of Philadelphia. Roz.
Hello, Chris, from the city of brotherly love, where tonight there is some concern about whether or not all of the votes that have been cast in today's election are actually going to be counted. In this particular case, we are talking about potentially tens of thousands of absentee ballots cast by people who are Philadelphia residents. The Republican Party went to federal judge William Yon late this morning and said that the Philadelphia Board of Elections did not provide the party with a complete and accurate list of people who had obtained an absentee ballot so that they could go ahead and try to challenge people at the polls for perhaps voting twice. The judge, after hearing a discussion about it all afternoon, decided that there could be a problem here, so he has issued a temporary restraining order, meaning that none of the absentee ballots that were cast as of 8 o'clock Eastern Time will be included in tonight's unofficial tally of the vote in the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. There will be a hearing tomorrow morning at 9:30 Eastern in Judge Yon's chambers, in courtroom. However, this could affect, as I said, the tally of, or victory of, the margin of victory, I should say, for either John Kerry or George W. Bush. This is a situation where the Board of Elections has decided not to appeal the judge's decision and try to go into court tomorrow to make a good faith argument. The Democratic Party late this afternoon tried to make itself a party to this dispute. That was turned down. So basically, there could be tens of thousands of votes that are not included in the Pennsylvania tally tonight, and that could affect who gets to be the winner of the 21 electoral votes that Pennsylvania brings to the table. Chris.
Are the Republican people who are making this an issue, are they afraid that the Democrats are going to try to vote people twice in Philadelphia? Once as absentees and once as people who vote on Election Day?
No, as I understand it, the concern really was, Chris, about the margin of victory. There is a truism in Pennsylvania that if John Kerry could pick up a margin of victory of at least 350,000 votes, that's according to Mayor John Street, or perhaps at least 400,000 votes margin of victory in the city of Philadelphia, experts here say that they could consider this a bellwether that John Kerry would win Pennsylvania. So there has been concern about Republicans trying to hold down the margin of victory in the state's largest city and, of course, the biggest media market. We don't know really yet what the total effect of this order will be from Judge Yon, because we don't really know exactly how many absentee ballots were actually given out, how many people are supposed to be on that list.
Thank you very much, Raj Jordan. In Philadelphia, quickly, what does that mean in terms of the history of Philadelphia, in this fight between the city and the rest of the state?
Well, they've got to bring at least 350,000 out of Philadelphia in order to carry the state. I think they've been so optimistic. You've talked to the governor, Eddie Rendell, so optimistic about Democratic voting, big Democratic voting in Pennsylvania, that I don't suspect it's going to be a big problem overall. You know, it would only be a problem if we got to a case where popular vote was an issue. But I think that from our visit there, you and I last week, it seemed to us that Pennsylvania was pretty solid when we talked even to Congress members from out.
Highly optimistic about 400,000 even coming out of the city. Let's, for all of our viewers right now, we're going to tell you what's going on in the campaign right now. And what's going on right now in the campaign is going on in Ohio. Let's go to Brian Williams to analyze the exit polling. It'll tell you what's causing that conflict, that closeness of the campaign and the election count in Ohio. Brian.
And Chris, we have some of the stats you've been specifically interested in, along with a whole lot of people watching. Specifically in Ohio, as we've been talking about, there are about 800,000 of those newly registered voters in that state out of nearly 8 million voters statewide. Now, our NBC News exit poll is providing some important information about how these new voters are affecting tonight's race. First-time voters made up a larger share of those who cast ballots for president in Ohio than they did nationally, 13% in Ohio. Those first-time voters in Ohio backed John Kerry by a significant margin, in fact, 56% to 44%. Now, who are these first-time Ohio voters? 7 in 10 of them under 30 years of age. In terms of party, we're told there is likely to be Republicans as Democrats. 4 years ago, in his race against Al Gore, the president ran slightly better with Ohio voters who were under 30 than he did with voters age 60 and above. This year, totally different story. Kerry is capturing the under 30 vote in Ohio by 58 to 41, making them the strongest single age group for John Kerry. President Bush's best age group in Ohio, age 60 and older. They backed the president by a margin of 56-44. Now, one other place where young voters may be helping John Kerry tonight, we've talked about North Carolina. The president won big in 2000. It is still close tonight. Part of the reason 1 in 7 voters there today were under the age of 30. John Kerry is getting 60% of that vote in all these states we're watching tonight. Chris?
Okay, thank you very much, Brian Williams. Let's go right now to Chip Reed at Make Your Vote Count nationwide voting program. Let's go to Chip.
Hi, Chris. We have had just a smattering of problems all across the country today, but most of them have been relatively minor. Lots of long lines, lots of polls staying open a little bit late, a number of polls opened early. We have had some serious problems. In Milwaukee, for example, there's a criminal investigation right now. Apparently 30 vans that were going to be used for the Republican Get Out the Vote effort had their tires slashed. Here in Detroit, 2 things. Number 1, they lost power at a voting place and they had to vote in the dark. And now we are told the NAACP has filed suit to keep some of the polls open in Detroit, alleging that voters have been intimidated on the basis of race. And that is something that's in court as we speak. And one other interesting thing, Chris, you see this cover, this fuchsia or magenta color all over the map. That is electronic voting. In fact, significantly down here in southern Florida, of course, Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade counties, there have been relatively few problems with that. A lot of people thought the big story today might be problems with electronic voting. It has not been. Chris?
Okay, thank you, Chip Reed. Let's go back to David Gregory at the White House with some info about the president's brother and his location tonight and what it means. David.
Chris, you remember 4 years ago, Jeb Bush was in the room with the president and his family. They were out to dinner in Austin, Texas, when the news from Florida started to turn bad. The president's brother got up, hugged him, and said, "I've let you down, brother." And then they went back to the governor's mansion. He started working the phones. Well, this go around, there's plenty of family behind me in the White House residence. Governor Jeb Bush of Florida is not among them. He is in Tallahassee tonight. They are counting on his high approval ratings in that state to not only kick up their ground operation, which is critical tonight, which has been a major focus for their political operation tonight, but as well to just keep tabs on what's going on down there as the night progresses. Operatives in the White House down in Florida making very clear to reporters, no early predictions here, they say. Remember the panhandle. Remember getting out our vote later in the night. They still think it is extremely tight there. Chris?
You know, David, I've heard from a lot of people down in Florida that the areas worst hit by the hurricanes were in Republican areas, and therefore the gratitude that most citizens would feel toward a governor for the rehabilitation and the recovery efforts wouldn't be felt in areas that would help the president. Is that your sense?
Well, I mean, it was certainly something that they were paying attention to. It is one of the sources right now of Jeb Bush's political strength. It's one of the reasons why it was so important for political advisors to get the president out to Florida. Remember, the day before the first debate, the morning of the very first debate, some people thought that was a mistake, that he was too tired for the first debate. They take it very seriously that not only the president's brother, but even his presence there in a role that John Kerry can't match as commander-in-chief, as president, somebody who can deliver in a time of need, was very important.
Okay, thank you very much, David Gregory at the White House. That's interesting stuff, isn't it, Andrea?
Well,
we're watching almost like the president's brother. It's almost like a dynastic, a bit of information there. What's Jeb doing tonight? What's the king and the king's brother doing tonight?
He's trying to deliver. I thought also that Brian Williams' information on the Ohio youth vote is just so interesting.
Give me those numbers.
Well, the new voters in Ohio,
I got a 58-41 among those 1829.
Are Kerry over Bush. 4 years ago, the president did better with younger voters, and also interestingly, he's now doing 56-44 with the older voters.
You know, this is an amazing moment tonight. We're coming up on 8 o'clock in the East, and this is the time we can give you, hopefully, the biggest results of the night. Perhaps Florida, Pennsylvania, Missouri, New Hampshire, Maine, and all the other 17 states. They're all coming up in just a very few seconds right now. And we're also going to have a surprise guest. We've got former governor of Vermont, Howard Dean.
America shows uncertainty or weakness. In this decade, the world will drift toward tragedy.
Saddam Hussein didn't attack us. Osama bin Laden attacked us. Al-Qaeda attacked us.
First of all, what my opponent wants you to forget is that he voted to authorize the use of force and now says it's the wrong war at the wrong time at the wrong place.
Iraq was not even close to the center of the war on terror before the president invaded.
As promised, it's 8 o'clock Eastern time. Let's take a look at some of these results. We've got some calls to make. Also, once again, a state that's too close to call. Florida, no surprise. Ohio was too close to call. Florida's now too close to call. That's the big news of this hour. And we're finding a certain pattern here tonight. It's called a close election. Too close to call. Florida, with 16% of the vote counted, a difference of only 133,000 votes between the president and John Kerry. Too close to call the state of Florida. In Illinois, John Kerry has carried Illinois. His first big win of the night, not unexpected. That follows, of course, his victory in Vermont. Illinois, a big state in the big heart of the country. John Kerry, the projected winner. In New Jersey, a lot of talk right now. John Kerry, the projected winner in New Jersey. Boy, they were talking about that one for a while. The Republicans hoping to poach that from last time's list. New Jersey, projected to go for John Kerry. Tennessee, President Bush, projected winner in the volunteer state. George Bush, the President of the United States, is projected to carry Tennessee. Massachusetts, no surprise here. John Kerry has carried the Bay State, his home state where he's represented it for all these years in the United States Senate. In Maryland, another Democratic state going for, as projected here, and all the votes are counted. NBC expects that John Kerry will carry Maryland tonight. Connecticut, again. John Kerry, the projected winner in the state of Connecticut. No surprise whatever. That is a state that has been in the expected blue state column all campaign long. In Alabama, again, no surprise. President Bush has carried, according to our projections, the state of Alabama today. Projected winner, the President of the United States in Alabama. In Oklahoma, President Bush projected to win that state after all the votes are counted. In Oklahoma, the Sooner state, again, no surprise. This is the red and the blue of American life we're watching here tonight. In Maine, again, another blue state for John Kerry, the Democratic challenger. When all the votes are counted, we project he will win the state of Maine. In Delaware, another bellwether state. This is a bellwether state, but usually Democratic. Last time it went for Al Gore. This time it's going, according to our projections, for John Kerry. Delaware, making a lot of calls early tonight here. Let's take a look at the District of Columbia. Absolutely no surprise, heavily Democratic. The District of Columbia has voted, according to our projections, for John Kerry. Too close to call again. The big story right now of the hour, Florida, which decided last time's election and put President Bush into the White House thanks to a Supreme Court ruling. Still too close to call, and that means something. That means the votes coming in are so close together that NBC cannot project a winner. Another state too close to call, and this is significant, Missouri, or in its more rural areas called Missouri. Too close to call, that is significant. That's a culturally conservative state where John Kerry has a shot. In Pennsylvania, this is a surprise, too early to call, but it doesn't mean much because we don't have the numbers yet. I should say it's not a surprise until we've got more numbers. This simply means we don't have enough votes to count yet, not that the two candidates are too close. Too early means too early in Pennsylvania. In New Hampshire, another state too early to call. That means, again, a small state, but we haven't got enough of a sample to make a judgment as to who's going to win this thing. It may well be a lopsided victory or defeat for either candidate. We simply know it's too early. Another state too early to call. Don't make any assumptions on this. Mississippi, a long time and predictably, I should say reliably, Republican state. Ohio, once again, I say it again, too close to call. That means that the numbers coming in that we're looking at in our samples and our sample precincts are simply too close together to decide who's going to reject, in fact, who's going to win this thing. Too close to call in North Carolina. A big surprise there, I think. Most people would have said that the Tar Heel state would have been safely Republican. As they expected, I think that Virginia would be safely Republican. Too close to call in North Carolina. Too close. Virginia, too close. Interesting along the eastern seaboard how we have these closer races. One possibility tonight, after all the votes are counted, is that Kerry does much better in the east, north, and south than expected. Let's go to South Carolina. Too early to call. We don't have enough votes there to count. You have to understand everyone's being very cautious this year to make sure that when a call is made, it holds. We're looking at the map right now. 3 for Kerry. Actually, it's going up to 77 for Kerry, thanks to that big one in Illinois, etc., and across the eastern seaboard. You'll notice that Kerry's doing very well along the Atlantic coast there, with the exception, I should say, of Illinois. Most of his votes so far are coming from the eastern seaboard. The president's polling 66. Now let's talk about those all-important races in the U.S. Senate. In Illinois, Barack Obama is the projected winner. There's a popular fellow. Here, what an interesting background. Raised in Hawaii. His mother's from Kansas. His father's from Kenya. What an interesting background he has. Barbara Mikulski, a real veteran of Democratic politics. He comes from Baltimore, as it's pronounced there, Balmer. Barbara Mikulski, the projected winner in Maryland. Let's look at this one. Kit Bond. Christopher Bond, a Republican, been around for a while, former governor of Missouri. He is the projected winner according to our tabulations in the United States Senate race in Missouri. Let's go right now. Richard Shelby in Alabama, another expected winner, a projected winner now thanks to our calculations. Richard Shelby, the projected winner in Alabama. Another no surprise, Christopher Dodd, a man who came within a vote of becoming the Democratic leader in the United States Senate. Christopher Dodd, who often appears on the Dynamis radio show. Christopher Dodd, a projected winner in the state of Connecticut. Judd Gregg, what an interesting fellow is. Look at that young fellow. He served as the sparring partner for President Bush in preparing for his debates with John Kerry. He's been reelected up there in New Hampshire, according to our projections, and looks rather handily winning that reelection there. And here's an interesting one. Too close to call. This is big news out of Pennsylvania. Too close. Apparently, Joe Hoppe was fighting a more considerable challenge to Arlen Specter, the longtime veteran in Pennsylvania, than expected. That race is too close to call in my home state of Pennsylvania. Another race too close to call. This is Mel Martinez, the HUD secretary the president got to run for the United States Senate to help bolster his strength in the U.S. Senate. He's having a close race with Betty Castor, the Democratic candidate, with just 17% of the vote reporting. Another close race, either too early to call, I should say, in Oklahoma between Brad Carson, the Democrat, and Tom Coburn, the Republican, the medical doctor. Too early to call. That doesn't mean much, except we don't have the numbers. That may well be a landslide in either direction, although who knows in Oklahoma. A lot of interesting close-to-call races developing tonight. And this one, this may be one of the great close-to-calls tonight in the Tar Heel state. Richard Burr, Republican, Erskine Bowles, former chief of staff to Bill Clinton. What an interesting race between two very estimable, impressive candidates. I think the Senate will win in either case with those fellas. We've got a too close to call race in Kentucky. Again, Jim Bunning, Hall of Fame pitcher, very popular in the country, very well known, I should say, in the country, finding himself, look at this, 61% of the vote counted, and they're still running too close to call an unknown Mangiardo, the man that was referred to by some in a very unpleasant way on the Republican side. Very nasty campaign there. Too close to call U.S. Senate in South Carolina. Who would have expected this? Inez Tenenbaum, we've seen her debate on Meet the Press. A Democratic woman in the South, a tough race. Any way you look at it, fighting what looks to be a very close race against the favorite, Jim DeMint. And now let's go right now to a man who may, by many people, have lit the fuse of John Kerry. Howard Dean, you could have been a contender. You could have been a contender. You were a contender. What do you think? Could you have been here? Could you have gone this far had you won the nomination with your very strong anti-war position?
Who knows? Woulda, coulda, shoulda. I think Kerry's doing great, but the thing I want to emphasize on is that this is we got a long way to go. There's still some polls open in places like Oregon, Washington, Hawaii. We got to have people continue to go to the polls. These big crowds are great for John Kerry. We want to keep those big crowds coming.
The other night, Tom Brokaw of NBC News asked the president, right face-to-face like we are, is this a referendum on the war in Iraq? And the president said no, it's a referendum on leadership. How did you read that dialogue?
I think it is a referendum on three things. It's the president's conduct in general, not just the war in Iraq, it's also the economy. 250,000 jobs lost in Ohio, thousands. Oregon has got one of the highest unemployment rates in America. And the deficits. The deficits are a big issue in places like New Hampshire, in the South, where people know that the deficits are causing the loss of jobs. So I think it is a referendum on leadership. I just think the president's come up somewhat short.
Do you think, I hate to ask you this, I'm going to ask you again, should the Democrats have run a clear anti-war candidate like you, or a man who's to some extent managed to fudge the issue, John Kerry?
You know, Chris, right now John Kerry is ahead by 11 electoral votes. I think second guessing is probably the wrong thing to do.
So in other words, he did it the right way.
He looks like he's done it the right way. We got a long way to go tonight. We want that turnout to keep cranking out in those tight states where the polls are still open: Colorado, Nevada, Oregon, Hawaii. But right now, things are looking reasonably
good. Not to scare the horses, but would you like to be a member of the cabinet of John Kerry?
One thing I have learned is A, you never answer that question, and B, people who appoint their cabinets before they win don't get to appoint them after they win. So that one, you're not getting me anywhere near that.
What have you learned watching the general election return so far tonight? West Virginia, it's going south on the Democrats. Virginia, North Carolina, too close to call. What do you make of that?
Well, Virginia and North Carolina, those states are changing a lot. There are a lot of people moving in. They've lost a lot of
Northerners moving in.
A lot of Northerners moving in, but a lot of jobs lost, and the textile industry is decimated. North Carolina and South Carolina, and people resent that. I think you're going to see a closer race, both between John Kerry and George Bush, and I think Inez Tenenbaum has a real shot in South Carolina because of the job loss situation. That's hurting the president everywhere in America.
One of the spookiest things to happen in America recently was the reemergence of the visage of Osama bin Laden just before the weekend. What impact do you think that had?
Well, at the time, I thought it was going to help the president because I think anytime you mention terrorism, according to the polls, that helped. But you saw the president's collapse in his advantage on terrorism. I think the reappearance of Osama reminded people that he hadn't been caught, and it's been 3 years. A lot of tough talk, not much action on the terrorism front.
Is that the way you read it when you first saw it?
No, when I first saw it, I thought this was going to be helpful to President Bush, but I don't think it was.
Judge Scarborough, what do you think of that? Let's talk about the visage of this fellow, sort of an apparition in a sense of just a video, no shots fired, no bombs went off, no suicide attacks, just a video. And all of a sudden, it may have had some impact. What do you think?
Well, you look at the Newsweek poll that dropped about the same time last week. There was a 20% gap between Americans. Who do you trust to win the war on terror, George W. Bush or John Kerry? A 20% gap. The President of the United States leading by 20%. And then all of a sudden, Osama bin Laden comes back into our lives. We see this picture of him. And I'll guarantee you, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, most everybody I spoke with thought because there had been this 20% gap, and the gap had been that way through the whole campaign, that it was going to have much more of an impact than apparently it's ended up having.
Let me ask you about young people, because I think objectively, conservatives, middle-of-the-roaders, and any objective observer would say you turned on the kids, right?
And
now we were looking at this number, Andrea and I, in Ohio, a state that's going to be very important in the final count. It may decide this election. Among those 18, you know these kids, 18 to 29. 58-41 for Kerry. Did you give him that turkey, that Thanksgiving turkey?
What it was, Chris, was intensity. When the young people in this country decided it was their time, and it is their time. This is a generational election. This is an election that's going to change generations. I told college kids all through this campaign, after I dropped out of the race, that this is yours to win. If you show up, John Kerry is going to be the next president of the United States. We'll see what happens in Ohio, but it looks like they certainly showed up.
Do you think it's because of the war they showed up? What other issues bother young people?
I think they're very worried about the deficits. Interestingly, the deficits don't appear on older people's issues. It's jobs, it's health insurance, it's schools, it's...
Did you worry about the deficit when you were 25 years old?
This is a different generation, Chris.
Why do they worry?
It's because they know they're getting the bill. They know the president, every time the president charges $87 billion for the war in Iraq and doesn't pay for it, it gets charged to the kid's credit card. And they feel it because it's much harder for them to pay for college now. The three issues for kids are the deficit, environment, and paying for college, and they connect the deficit with the difficulty in paying for college. They know that money goes to the president's millionaire friends, and it comes out of the middle-class people's tax cut, which is their parents.
Okay, it's great having you on, Governor. Thank you.
My
I know you have to leave.
And I'll guarantee, I mean, you ask somebody in college if they think they're going to get Social Security, they'll laugh at you.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Let's go right now to Keith Olbermann right now. Let's got to look at what else is happening in the elections right now, because there's a lot of else happening besides the presidency and the Senate race. Let's go, Keith.
Particularly, Chris, the swing in the Senate is now a push. As you perhaps, if you've been with us throughout the night, you know that the first call of a change in a Senate seat occurred in Georgia, where it becomes now a Republican seat after having been Zell Miller's seat, nominally anyway, a Democratic seat. And now that push, that 1-point advantage, if you will, has been obviated by the results from Illinois that we projected just a few moments ago, that Barack Obama would indeed defeat Alan Keyes, the former presidential candidate twice, former replacement for the original Republican nominee, Jack Ryan, who left under unfortunate circumstances. But earlier, as we projected, the Georgia seat would change hands from the Democrats to the Republicans, and Congressman Johnny Isakson defeating Denise Majette. So right now, the advantage that was originally gained in Georgia has been obviated by an advantage for the Democrats in Illinois taking over a Republican seat. Let's look at the 5 of the 11 key governors' races, 5 of the 11 governors' races, where it's too close to call in Missouri in the race between the Democrat McCaskill, the state auditor, and the Republican, the Secretary of State, Mr. Blunt. In Delaware, where Governor Ruth Ann Minner is the incumbent, is now being challenged by Bill Lee, the Republican, also the repeat of their 2000 competition, and that one is too early to call. In New Hampshire, still too early to call there, between John Lynch, the businessman who is challenging the incumbent governor, Republican Craig Benson. Too early to call in New Hampshire. Too early to call in Vermont, where the mayor of Burlington, Peter Clavelle, is challenging the Republican incumbent, Jim Douglas. And now still too early to call in Indiana, where the incumbent Joe Kernan, who replaced the late Frank O'Bannon last year, is being challenged by the former OMB director, Mitch Daniels. So a run of governor's races, Chris, that are too early to call, meaning we'll have them probably later on. Back to you.
Okay, thank you, Keith. And in Maine, where they do divide up the electoral votes by this congressional district, there's one unknown result there. There's 3 of the 4 electoral votes in Maine are going to go to John Kerry, but there's one still out there that might well go either way at this point right now. Let me go to former governor, actually current governor, Bill Owens of Colorado, who's out in Denver right now. He's a Republican. No, you're still in office, sir. I didn't knock you out. Thank you. Give us a sense of the West, because my hunch is the pattern of the country is going to be uneven as we count the vote tonight.
You know, I think you're right, Chris. I think it's awfully early, but we're still waiting to see what's going to happen in Colorado. Recent polls have shown the president well ahead in Colorado, 4, 5, 6, even 7%. Same thing in New Mexico by a smaller margin. Nevada is going to be a battleground state, and so we still have the polls open out here in the West, and so we're still involved in the campaigning. But it's going to be close across the country. Very well might be close in parts of the West, though we're obviously stronger for President Bush out here than some parts of the eastern seaboard.
Let's talk about values, because we've all been watching this election. You, sir, certainly are part of this electoral process at the presidential level. It seems to me that on the plate for the voter is not just terrorism and not just the economy and not just Iraq, but this larger palette of issues, from gay marriage, abortion rights. I guess you could throw in stem cell, maybe even gun rights. How are those going to play tonight, those values questions?
Well, again, I think that, and this has been reported from 4 years ago, if you're a regular church attender, if you regularly attend church, you're much more likely to support President Bush. There's a number of those sorts of social issues which divide these two candidates. Much of the Midwest, much of the West is pretty conservative socially, and so I think that's one of the reasons why the president does pretty well out here. I think it's one of the reasons why he's going to do well in Colorado this evening.
Which way do you think the impact of the Latino or Hispanic vote is going to be felt? Who's going to win that vote in Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona?
You know, Chris, this president won a majority of the Hispanic vote his second race for governor in Texas. In Colorado, for example, I won a majority of the Hispanic vote the second time I ran for governor for re-election. And so I think they're very much in play. I think we're going to see the president do well, but a lot of it depends on if this is first generation, if these people have gotten to know this president. But his record in Texas was he does very well with the Hispanic electorate once they get to know him. I think he'll do well much of the West tonight. He won't win a majority, but I think he's going to be competitive.
Let me ask you lastly, because we're going to have to be talking about this as we get closer to midnight in the East Coast. Is there a difference culturally between living in your part of the country and living in the East?
You know, it really is. We have these wide open spaces. We're not quite as crowded. We don't have some of the social issues in terms of the high rates of welfare and even some of the drug dependence that we sometimes see in more populated areas of the country. I think the West is more optimistic. We're more ready to and we're also more nationalistic. We're often more patriotic in one sense. And so I think that this president is going to do very well out here in the West. We actually regard him as a Westerner. Texas is a southwestern state, and in many respects he's a neighbor. So the election is still a long way to go this evening. President Bush is going to win Colorado. I think he's going to do well in much of the West.
Are you thinking of the presidency yourself, Governor?
You know, I'm not. I've been asked that a few times, but we're going to have some outstanding candidates. We have one election tonight to get past. Then we're going to let these candidates start to prepare for 4 years from now.
Okay, it's great having you back on the show. You're always on.
Thanks,
and always
Chris.
welcome. Thank you very much. Let me
Thank
go
you.
right back to our panel. Thank you, Governor Bill Owens of Colorado, a man who I believe has great ambitions. What do you think, Joe?
I think he does too. You know, one other issue though that he didn't bring up has to do with the environment. I found when I was in Congress, because I was always baffled people because I was a Republican, I was from the South, but I also had water all around me, so I was an environmentalist.
Hold that thought, Joe. I'm sorry, we got a big call to make right now for NBC, a projection we're about to make right now. In North Carolina, here it comes. President Bush is the projected winner in the Tar Heel State in the presidential race tonight. That was expected. It took a while. He has won. We still want to know, of course, how that Senate race is going in North Carolina between Richard Burr, the Republican, and Erskine Bowles, the former chief of staff to President Clinton. Look at these numbers. Aren't these interesting? There's the president. This is going to be an interesting night as we watch this. So having a cup of coffee, because I think this election's going to look like that throughout the night, neck and neck. We haven't seen one like this before. This could be like Richard Nixon and John Kennedy back in 1960. Anyway, that's how it looks right now in the electoral map. Andrea.
Well, one other small note about North Carolina. The reason it is as close as it perhaps is in North Carolina, even though Bush has clearly won it, is that, or that we're projecting Bush has won it, is that the young voters in North Carolina came out heavily for Kerry. They came out, and according to the exit polling, at least 1 in 7 voters there were under the age of 30, and Kerry got 60% of their vote.
Okay, let's go. I didn't know you finished your thought, Joe.
No, what I was going to say is I always found it so interesting how angry people in the West were, Colorado especially, on environmental issues. They felt like there was a war on the West. And even when there were people, I could agree with them on 99% of the issues, but if I voted in what was considered to be a pro-environmental issue, they would consider it to be a war on the West. That's one of the reasons why I think George W. Bush is going to end up carrying places like Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, because they're more comfortable with him than they are. And also the same thing with it's what happened in West Virginia 4 years ago, and now they're more comfortable with his environmental record. As much as the blue staters may hate it, than they are than, say, those in the red states.
Is that because they want more control over their land?
Exactly. It all has to do with land rights.
Okay, we're going right now to Keith Oberman. Keith. Okay, we're not going to Keith right now. We're going to go to Brian Williams right now. Brian.
Chris, thanks. And here in the tracking center, we are looking specifically at the role the war in Iraq will play in this election, such a huge issue in the campaign. And on Election Day, Iraq continues to divide Americans, both on the wisdom of the policy and how the war overall is progressing. Voters today were split on whether invading Iraq was the right decision. 48% approve of the decision to go to war. And no surprise, if you've been following this issue, 48% disapprove of the call to go to war. As for how the war is being fought, just 12% think it's going very well. Another third think it's going somewhat well, but more than half of the voters in the election, 55%, believe the war in Iraq is going badly. One of the most important differences between President Bush and Senator Kerry is the fact that the president has argued that the war in Iraq is part of a war on terrorism. John Kerry calls Iraq a distraction from the war. NBC News exit polling finds the public evenly divided on who's right here. Just over half the voters today said the invasion of Iraq is part of a larger war on terror, as the president insists. Almost as many disagree and say it is separate and apart from the war on terror. Now, on the broader question of whether the war in Iraq has improved the security of the U.S., more voters than not say it has not. As you might expect, opinion on all of these questions closely related to which candidate people voted for in the presidential race, as we keep looking at the numbers here. Chris, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Brian Williams. That's a fascinating number. Let's go to Nora O'Donnell at the White House. Nora.
And good evening to you, Chris. The president is currently in the residence. We are told now there are about a dozen, dozens of people, 25 to 30 family and friends gathered with him. They're dining on beef tenderloin and smoked salmon while there's a war room set up in the Roosevelt Room, where all of his top advisors, including Karl Rove, are poring over the data. Karl Rove shuttling back and forth to give the president updates. I'm also told that the president has been making several phone calls to his campaign headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, touching base with Ken Mellman, his campaign manager. One interesting thing, I've been on the phone for the last hour talking to Republicans across the country who are expressing a great deal of anxiety. They are talking to people inside the campaign. They are looking at what they think are sort of different exit poll data that may be out there on internet websites. They're concerned. The reaction from the Bush campaign, from those in the White House, is hold on. That exit poll data may not be good stuff. It's certainly not what the networks are reporting. And let's wait till we get in the real votes from the people and when those votes are posted. So we're sort of in a wait and see mode is what there is the phrase that I have heard from the campaign. One campaign advisor saying it's kind of screwy, all those numbers that are floating around out there. They still feel very confident at this point that they're doing well in Florida, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Chris?
Let's go back, as some viewers may not have heard this before. I watched the president, as did everyone who has a TV set, in the last couple of days. His expression has changed from his usual cheeriness. In fact, if you look back 2 or 3 weeks, it was astounding how upbeat he was until 2 days ago. What happened?
The president was enormously upbeat, as was his campaign staff, who on Halloween night donned camouflage jackets and walked off Air Force One to mock and make fun of Senator Kerry. Then, of course, some marathon campaigning, 20-hour-long days. And then this morning, when the president appeared to vote in Crawford, Texas, he looked very tired and a little bit more tense. The First Lady looked like she was forcing a smile, holding the president's hand very tightly. There are pictures of the president's campaign advisors looking on, who looked like they had some concern in their face. It may also have been they were very tired. It was a very long day. But clearly, sometimes you can read on someone's face the concern. And at this morning, of course, they know that this was very close, and advisors readily admit they had hoped that at this stage in the game to have pulled somewhat of a lead on Kerry, give them some comfort, if you will. They didn't have that. That's why it's know that it's this close. That's why the Ken Mellman, the campaign manager who's been directing this Get Out the Vote effort, told me they were going to blow off the doors, and why they decided to run dry runs, mock runs, Chris, in all of the target states practicing, like dress rehearsals, knocking on doors and driving the shuttle vans, etc., to try and ensure that they'll get their supporters to the polls. Chris?
Okay, thank you very much, Nora Donald at the White House. Let's go right now to Peter Alexander, who's at Columbus, Ohio, scene of one of the closest contests, and perhaps the most important of the contests tonight. Peter.
Good evening, Chris. There is a lawsuit that has been filed within the last 2 hours over the long lines in Ohio. We have learned that about an hour ago, a temporary restraining order was granted. Let's make it clear how this works. Democratic lawyers brought this suit in federal district court. It's against the boards of election in Knox County and Franklin County. That's here where we are in Columbus. It's significant because they are blaming the counties for failing to have enough voting machines, causing this new burden on the voters, causing lines that right now are still in excess of 3, in some places 4 hours. Anecdotally, we are hearing about some concerns that there aren't enough polling places within the polling places themselves. There are not enough booths. For example, at the St. Aloysius Church that we visited earlier today, just 3 booths today as opposed to 4 years ago when there were 5 booths. In this lawsuit, they are upset that the lines are too long and the burden is now on those voters. The suit is asking that the people waiting in line will be given paper ballots to remove that burden from them. The Democratic lawyers view that as a victory at this point. It's significant because in some of these places, people could be in line for the next 4 hours, lasting past midnight tonight. We'll keep you up to date on the situation right now, but this should make it possible for everybody who is in line right now to vote, even if there was some concern that some of those people were planning to leave those lines because they were simply so long. Chris?
Okay, thank you very much, Peter Alexander. A couple of thoughts. I want to get to Ron Reagan. I was impressed, as you may have been, by Governor Dean, who was just here. Dean, in a way, ignited the Democratic campaign against President Bush. Before he came along, there wasn't a campaign. Everybody's playing it safe.
Yeah.
What's your assessment as his role in this?
I was sad that he left so early because I wanted to give him credit for something. We've been talking about the youth vote here, and you know, in 1972, 18-year-olds got the right to vote and immediately began dragging down the national average of voting. You know, they'd talk a good game, you could get them registered, but they wouldn't go to the polls. Not this time, I don't think. And Howard Dean is partly responsible for that. He made voting, he made involvement cool again. Apathy used to be cool. It is not now.
No, it is not. And also, we're going to have an announcement to make here. We've got Arkansas coming up here at the half hour at 8:30 Eastern Time. We're going to be making an announcement in just a very few seconds now.
See how you can lead this country in a time of war if you change your mind because of politics.
The president didn't find weapons of mass destruction, so he's really turned his campaign into a weapon of mass deception.
Let's take a look. It's going to be an interesting development here because this is one of the states where, of course, former President Bill Clinton campaigned hard and enthusiastically. We're looking right now, too early to call in Arkansas, unfortunately, the Razorback State. It's interesting because I'm going to be watching tonight, as everyone's going to be watching, to see one of the many small shows tonight we're all interested in, those of us who focus on everything, whether Bill Clinton was able to move this campaign in the direction of John Kerry in its closing week. We're looking now at a very, very close race in the electoral vote. And you're looking up on our building here at 30 Rock to see it dramatized. The president is leading. He may end up leading tonight overall. But they're both a long way from 270 electoral votes, and that is the requirement. This election is not won till a candidate has 270 electoral votes. And from the way we've been counting the votes tonight, with great confidence, but also with tremendous care, it may take a while. Here we have a vote, the call in the United States Senate race in Oklahoma, the Sooner State. The Republican candidate, Dr. Tom Coburn, is the projected winner for the United States Senate race in Oklahoma. That was a race that a lot of people were watching, and the Democrat ran a tough campaign but didn't win. Too early to call also, or rather too early to call in this case, the Blanche Lincoln re-election campaign in Arkansas. So that's an 8:30 close. And once again, we have ourselves with not enough votes to begin to count and make a call. Let's look right now in the Florida race. This is the Mel Martinez race. As I said, the former HUD secretary pushed very heavily by the President Bush, to make that run for senator from Florida to replace Democrat Bob Graham. Too close to call. These are states that are so interesting. Too close to call in North Carolina for Erskine Bowles. Interesting how close these races on the eastern seaboard are. Who would have thought this? Too close to call in Pennsylvania, where you have a veteran top-notch politician, I mean professional politician like Arlen Specter facing a tough race. Too close to call in Kentucky with 72% of the vote in. Jim Bunning has not locked it up. Too close to call in South Carolina, an extremely conservative state, yet Inez Tenenbaum, the Democratic candidate, holds on in this fight. Too close to call, and that means something. And here we have a new call from NBC to make right now. In the race for president in South Carolina, no surprise here, but it took a while. George Bush, the president, has a projected victory coming his way in the state of South Carolina. So here we're going to take a look at the map right now and see how it looks. It's getting redder at the bottom there, and you notice the pattern. It's so interesting how it develops here. Red across that southern midsection on the East Coast, blue across the upper northeast up there along the coast. This is the pattern we're probably going to be able to project across the country. It's so interesting. It's how we vote. The South is red, the South is conservative, the North is Democratic, and it is fighting a close race between these two regions. And what I think was going to happen tonight, we are going to have an election, most of us think, between North and South that will be decided by the Midwest. That's where a lot of the decisions are going to be made. It's so fascinating. The North and South can't agree, so let's ask the Midwest to help decide this election for us. Let's go to Carl Kentney, who's definitely in the North. He's up in Boston right now with Kerry. How's that good humor holding up there, Carl?
It's holding up, Chris. I mean, the South, it really isn't surprising too many Democrats we're talking to at this hour. I was talking to one Democrat who said Georgia was, quote, gone, and that must have been an hour or so ago. A lot of nervous energy on this end, some good energy. One aide to the campaign described it as being up in the third quarter, up by a field goal. Still a long way to go, and the margin really not that high, as you mentioned. You got to remember, the campaign is staffed with a lot of survivors from 2000 who were there when the early exit polls came in and did look good for Gore, only to see things turn later in the night. So being extremely cautious. The Clinton effect, Chris, that you mentioned, they're watching very closely, not only in Arkansas, but also in Florida and in New Mexico, the three big states where the former president campaigned. As one aide said, Chris, there's no towel snapping going on quite yet in the locker rooms of the Kerry campaign, Chris.
I love that phrase. Let me ask you about the way they're reading the White House. We just had Norah O'Donnell on from the White House, and she said they're inside plotting and planning to try to squeeze a few more votes out. But they did notice, the correspondents at the White House, including Norah, the rather serious face on the president coming back today and in a couple days ago as well. How are the Kerry people reading the Bush people right now?
Well, actually, Bob Shrum, Kerry's main strategist, was asked about that yesterday or the day before. They was asked, what do you make of Karl Rove's bravado? You know, when they come out on the tarmac with camouflage on, making fun of his goose hunting trip in Ohio, and he said Shrum's line was that's how Republicans work it. They have this philosophy that the appearance of winning leads to winning, which obviously the Democrats are rather negative on. So I think at this point they're taking it with a grain of salt. It almost seems expected on their end.
You know why I think, Carl, they don't like it? Because remember 4 years ago, the Bush family all got together in that hotel room, and they all acted like they'd won. They showed confidence, and they sent a message to the country, hey, we won this thing. And a lot of people accepted that as a fact for the month ahead that included all that fighting.
Right. On the flip side, though, Chris,
I love this psychological war. I'll be back to you again because before we get numbers, we're going to try to figure out who's winning in other ways. Anyway, thank you, Carl Kentney. We're going to take a short break now for a commercial. We're going to come back. We're going to come back with Vanessa Carey, try to read her psychology and see what she's learned from the various numbers. Also, Joe Trippi's going to give us an update. And this is always a precursor of things to come. The blogs, the websites, what's the buzz out there, what's the chatter out there. Let's read them and find out and give it to you right away. We'll be right back with MSNBC's coverage from Democracy Plaza. Let's take a look at the recap right now. We've seen that the president has won 9 states. Let's count them: Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, West Virginia, all NBC states where NBC has projected the president will carry. Let's take a look at the states that NBC projects that John Kerry will carry. Connecticut, Delaware, District of Columbia, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Vermont, And if you listen to this crowd out here, you might say New York's on the way based upon the noise outside here. Let's take a look at the electoral votes. This is still interesting here, obviously. In the South, all that red for the president, President Bush. He's doing as expected, winning the states he was expected to win. Same with John Kerry. What we haven't seen yet tonight is a major or any kind of poach, where somebody reached over and took a red or took a blue from the other side. In other words, that's going to take some time because those states, intuition tells us, will be close.
And we're
Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico are going to be close races. And in fact,
and Ohio and Florida.
Some of the Kerry people think that Nevada.
I was just going to say, we're still waiting on New Hampshire. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Some of the Kerry people think Nevada could be close enough that they're going to try to send General Wes Clark out there tonight.
Before closing time.
Before closing time.
As Joe was
Maybe they should have put him on the ticket. Just guessing.
As Joe was saying, we're still waiting on New Hampshire. Now, Kerry should win New Hampshire, but I know they're going to feel a lot better if they get it in their pocket and that whole Northeast is colored in blue. You know, remember, if Gore won New Hampshire last time, we'd be talking about incumbent President Gore running for re-election.
But also New Hampshire gives George Bush some opportunities, even if he loses Ohio.
That's right.
To get over the top. I mean, obviously it's a much more difficult climb, but this is what I'm fascinated by: is we've had all this back and forth for so long, and yet this is played out. I mean, you could have predicted how these states were going to fall 4 years ago.
You want to predict the last 10?
They've played true to form so far.
How about predicting the last 10? That's going to be the hard one.
Yeah.
Figuring out how Wisconsin goes, how Iowa goes, how Pennsylvania goes, Ohio and Florida. They're going to be the toughest.
I still think it comes down to Florida and Ohio, and I think, right now, from what I hear, the lines are still long. We've heard the lines are long in Ohio. I just heard the line. There's a line of 500 people in Florida, Northwest Florida, still waiting. They're driving by with bullhorns, telling them not to go anywhere, singing "God Bless America." It is amazing, the intensity on both sides of this election. Remarkable.
I wish they could do it like they do at CVS at the drugstore. When a crowd starts to build, a line build, they call more people up to the counter, and they move faster, but we don't have that system. Let's go to Joe Trippi, who is Mr. State of the Art. What are the bloggers telling you, and what are you picking up, Joe?
Well, right now the blogs are focused on this race for the Senate in Kentucky, Chris, where just a month ago Jim Bunning, Republican senator from Kentucky, had a double-digit lead until he started making a series of gaffes. But the national press didn't really pay a lot of attention to it, didn't get picked up a whole lot in the local media, but the blogs really ran with it. The Mongiardo campaign, the Democratic challenger, recognized this, started running a blog ad campaign across the internet. The blogs contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars to Mongiardo. That made him real. And the next thing that happened was the Democratic Party, sensing he was real, sent him even more money.
Joe,
and that race is too close to call.
Joe, hold on for a second. We'll get right back to you. We've got a call to make in a big state on the East Coast. And now we are now projecting at NBC that President Bush will carry the Old Dominion. It took a couple hours, but he has won. By our projections, the state of Virginia, home to many correspondents and people on this panel, including Pat Buchanan. Joe, let's get back to you right now. See, it's right now 89 for 102 for the president right now, 77 for John Kerry. We will see how long it takes tonight, right through the morning. Let me go right back to Joe Trippi. Joe, this fight you're talking about, Jim Bunning, we just saw him. What a man, what a confident-looking fellow he is, the former baseball Major League Hall of Famer. Why is there such interest among the bloggers in that race in Kentucky for the Senate?
Well, he just made a whole series of gaffes. He compared Mongiardo to Saddam Hussein's son. He just made a whole series of things that somehow grabbed the blogosphere. And then what happened was the Mongiardo campaign smartly, I mean, almost like Howard Dean-like, started running these blog ads. And thousands of people gave Mongiardo money. The real thing here is, I don't know, it's too close to call, but if Mongiardo wins tonight, the Democrats and he owe the blogosphere the victory, because they're the people that rallied around this guy, got him the money and got him in the race and paid attention when most of us weren't.
Why Mongiardo? Just because he's a Democrat? Is that why the bloggers like him?
I think they were really, the first thing was when Bunning accused Mongiardo of looking like Saddam Hussein's son. There was something about that, I think, that got, of all places in Kentucky, got a bunch of anti-war Democrats all fired up to contribute to this guy around the nation. It just shows you what can happen, how this national movement that was out there from the Dean campaign and others can impact a state, even like a race like Kentucky. It really funneled a lot of money to Maggiardo. And again, it's tight, it's close, but it shouldn't have been. And if Maggiardo wins, it's because of the net.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe Tribby. Let's get back talk about Virginia with Pat Buchanan. Pat, you live in Virginia. It has a northern part, which is a bit more northern in more ways than one. What did you make of the president's victory there tonight?
Well, I think it's a good victory, Chris, and I expected it, and I was surprised it came a little bit later than I thought. But what is really interesting, Chris, is West Virginia. We've called that very early. That was a battleground state. That was one of those states that Kerry might be able to pull out of the president's pack, out of the Bush 278 electoral votes. He failed to do that. Now, what Kerry's got to do tonight is a very simple thing. Get 10 electoral votes out of Bush's present 278 red states. He has not yet gotten a single one there. And again, the fact that he didn't do it in West Virginia puts an increasing premium that he's got to do it in Ohio.
Well, let me ask you about Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida. Those three states right now, we're looking at the yellow states, the three on the right there. We have Pennsylvania, Ohio next to each other there in the northeast, and we've got Florida. And look at the size of the states, how they play a role. If you look at them proportional to their electoral votes, they are the big ones. And Tim Rush has been saying that all along, and I guess other people have recognized that the fact is, if you win, I guess that's a question I got to put to you. If you win 2 out of those 3, does that mean you're riding a national tide, or does that mean they just have the electoral sock to win?
It doesn't mean you may not be riding an electoral tide. You may lose California by 4 million votes. But what it means, Chris, is you're the next president of the United States. The man, if Bush wins Pennsylvania and Ohio, I believe he's going to be the next president of the United States, or Pennsylvania and Florida. What is interesting about West Virginia, too, Chris, I've been up there in that Weirton area. I was endorsed by those guys at that steel mill. You take that West Virginia steel and coal country, God, gays, and guns, that is identical to southwestern Ohio, the Mahoning Valley and the Mon Valley of western Pennsylvania, where my mother comes from. The movie Deer Hunter. Those are the type guys living up there. And in that little sub-state, they tend to vote the same way. So in a sense, this is good news for the president, not only in holding West Virginia, but in what it may say about southwestern Pennsylvania and southeastern Ohio.
That's guns and gays and God. I guess God is positive, guns are positive, gay is negative, right?
Well, that depends on your point of view, Chris.
Well, I'm just talking about how that parcel gets put together. Anyway, we're going to come back, take a break from Pat Buchanan and this cultural discussion. We're going to come back and talk to Vanessa Carey. She's going to be joining us right after this break. Looking at that cat go up there. Look at the red and the blue fighting. It will go up the wall of 30 Rock. It's like Batman going up that wall there. Anyway, it looks to me like the president's doing quite well tonight, but this is very early. The battle's for 270. And as Winston Churchill said, there's 2 kinds of victory. Initial and ultimate. And we're going to look about ultimate about 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, I think. Let's go right now to Lisa Myers, who's reporting on the Bush camp. Lisa.
Hi, Chris. A potentially significant development here. The Bush campaign has been laying the actual votes that have been coming in from the states against the exit poll data. And they find that the exit poll data is significantly underrepresenting the Republican vote. They specifically point to states like Virginia, South Carolina, and Florida. They say in each case, the actual vote patterns show a larger Republican vote than is represented in the exit poll data. The campaign manager, Ken Melman, was particularly excited about some of the data that they were seeing in Florida, along what Joe Scarborough will tell you was a very important part of the country, the I-4 corridor in the Orlando area. You have a lot of swing voters there, and Ken Melman says the vote there that they're showing now is larger than they got in 2000 and larger than it's is showing in the exit polls. So the Bush campaign, I think, is feeling a little bit better now than they were a couple of hours ago, but they still expect it to be a very long night. But they have real concerns about the exit polls, both state by state and nationally.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa Myers, with the Bush campaign. Let's go to Chip Reed with Make Your Vote Count. Chip. Chip.
Hi, Chris.
We're going to go to Chip Reed.
We are here in the Making Your
ready?
Vote. Yes, Chris, we are. We are here in the Making Your Vote Count Center. And we have an extraordinary piece of litigation coming out of Ohio. That really has been litigation central today. And Rick Pildes of NYU Law School has really grabbed onto this story coming out of Ohio. Give me an idea of what is happening out there. There are extraordinary lines, 3, 4, even 6 hours I've read in some precincts out there. And a judge has taken sympathy, basically, on these people and explained what he's done.
Well, this is really extraordinary because the turnout is so high in Ohio that we have these enormous lines. People are getting frustrated. A complaint was filed in federal court with all these affidavits from individual voters saying, I've been here 2 hours, 3 hours, I can't vote. And a federal judge ordered the Ohio County boards to let these people have paper ballots and just cast their vote now. The concern is people get frustrated, they leave the polls if the lines are too long. So a federal judge stepped in and said, give these people ballots, let them vote now.
Have you ever heard of anything like this before, this kind of creative judging on Election Day?
Well, I think judges are very sympathetic to the right to vote. They sometimes extend poll hours if necessary. They do try to protect the right to vote. I'm not sure I've seen anything quite like this before, but that's partly because these lines are so extraordinary in Ohio.
And there are other decisions. There's another case in Ohio pending right now on Bush v. Gore, going back to Florida.
Interesting. We're now seeing the return of Bush v. Gore, the Supreme Court's decision in the last election. In at least 2 cases today, courts have invoked Bush v. Gore or been asked to invoke Bush v. Gore to decide issues. So now we have a lawsuit in Ohio saying when these provisional ballots are counted that people are casting, the state of Ohio has to come up with uniform, consistent, statewide standards about how these ballots are going to be counted.
Because that is what the Supreme Court ruled back in 2000 in Florida.
Exactly. The Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore last time around said states must have uniform, consistent standards for how they treat votes and how they count votes. Now that's being invoked this time around to require the same treatment across the state of Ohio for these thousands and thousands of provisional ballots that are being cast today.
Okay. Rick Pildes, thank you very much. NYU Law School. Chris, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Chip Reed. It's coming up on 8:53. Let's see where the election stands now. Let's go to my colleague Keith Overman for an update on how the Senate looks right now and who's going to control it after all this is over. Keith.
So far, 2 changes, Chris, but no net change because with Barack Obama taking the projections for the Senate from Illinois, that's a Republican seat going to the Democrats, and then Jimmy Isaacson taking for the Republicans Zell Miller's old seat in Georgia for the Republicans. So coming up at the top of the hour, 6 minutes hence, we're looking forward to the closures in South Dakota and Colorado as prospective calls, where in South Dakota, $35 million spent on a senatorial race in the nation's smallest electorate, where John Thune, who lost in 2002 to Tim Johnson, is trying to unseat the Senate Minority Leader Tom Daschle. And in Colorado, what is still a toss-up, the Republicans currently hold this seat with Ben Nighthorse Campbell, but Pete Kors, who is maybe the second most famous Republican because of all the beer commercials running in this on this night, is trying to stave off the Colorado Attorney General, the Democrat Ken Salazar. So 1 change from Republican to Democrat, 1 from Democrat to Republican, and we might have 2 more at the top of the hour. Chris, back to you.
Thank you, Keith. Let's go right now to Chris Chansing, who's in Cleveland with some big news about how they're counting the absentee ballots in one of the most important states. Chris.
They have counted the absentee ballots larger than they were 4 years ago, 64% to 36% for John Kerry. Sounds like a huge number, but this, of course, a heavily Democratic area. If this is reflective of the vote countywide, it's less than the Democrats would like. They think they need a huge plurality here if they're going to win statewide. Also, I talked to Joanne Davidson. She's running the ground game for the Bush campaign. She tells me that they are watching very closely these long lines all across the state where they have people waiting 3 and 4 hours still. In Cleveland, the Nonpartisan Voter Protection Project is sending lawyers to investigate Hispanic voters who are forced to vote provisional ballots now. There's some broken voting machines that they're checking out in East Cleveland that may have delayed some people from voting. You know, earlier today, people were watching watching to see if there were charges of voter fraud or there were challenges here in Ohio. None of that materialized in any significant way. I talked to a top election law expert and I said, are you surprised? And he said, watch tonight at 7:30. If this is close, if there are still lines, you're going to start to see these thousands of lawyers who have been brought into Ohio by both of the parties going to work. That's exactly what we're seeing. Joanne Davidson said they're watching very, very closely to make sure all of their voters who were in line at 7:30 get to vote. Chris?
Thank you very much, Chris Jansing in Cleveland. Let's go right now to Dan Abrams to some of the problems across the country. Dan.
That seems to be one of the big problems coming up. You heard Rick Pildes talking about the problems in Ohio and the sort of novel way that they're trying to resolve the problem there. In Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, they have extended the voting there for an hour and a half to 9:30 from 8 o'clock. We're told that Republicans are appealing that decision by a judge. Again, anytime a judge extends the polling hours, it is very controversial. Also, 3 other counties in Pennsylvania, Lackawanna County, Mifflin County, Luzerne County, in those counties, the voting times were extended by a half hour, over an hour, at one point 40 minutes, in those cases all due to machine malfunctions or because people arrived at the voting booths late to start the voting process. Chris?
Thank you very much, Dan Abrams. We're getting a lot of, I don't know if it's dispiriting information, but it's coming from certain states. Have you noticed? The problems are in Ohio. The problems are in Pennsylvania. What's that about, Andrea?
Well, it's about the battleground states, and that's where the ground game is so intense. Allegheny County, as Dan Abrams just said, that's Pittsburgh. Lackawanna County, that's Scranton. That's your whole Cole County area as well, Democratic area. They've obviously got a problem in Ohio, and we're being told that there have been problems in Florida as well. A decision in Miami-Dade that they're not going to count the absentee ballots until Thursday or Friday. Big protests about that as well.
Well, you know, when we were growing up, we all read the Making of a President, Teddy White's book about the election of Jack Kennedy. And he used to say in his book, or he said in his book, that there's certain states like Minnesota where if the vote is one off, it means it. One less person voted for the guy. There's other states where you can't correlate the numbers with voter intentions. That there are a lot of things going on in those states that aren't quite regular. Joe, are you willing to venture a suggestion that some states don't run as clean election as others do?
Well, certainly. And you know, it's amazing that you talk about Teddy White's book. One of the first political books I ever read was The Making of the President in 1960. Of course, the part that Teddy White didn't talk about in 1960 was what happened in Chicago. And the fact that many people to this day believe that that election was stolen from Richard Nixon, who didn't protest the vote. So this isn't something new. I mean, it's been around for some time. Sam Giancana, the mob. I mean, you hear all this has been going on for quite some time. I agree with the mayor here, though. We ought to be able to figure out, in the 21st century, a way to do this more uniformly.
We're going to have to go right now. We're getting very close down to another one of these magic moments, 9 o'clock on the East Coast, where we're going to have a whole flurry of results to announce at 9. Look how far west these closings go. They'll be coming up in just a split second. Stay with us at MSNBC for the results any second now.
Lead the world in fighting a smarter, tougher, more strategic war on terror.
We stand for marriage and family, which are the foundations of our society.
We need a president who can stand up and fight for the middle class and for people struggling to get into it.
I will never turn over America's national security decisions to leaders of other countries.
Let's take a look at the news. No dramatic news right now in this block, but let's take a look at the news coming out. The calls we're going to try to make right now from NBC. It's 9 o'clock on the East Coast. Of course, a lot of big states have closed their voting. We're going to give you results as they come in. These states, by the way, include, well, here they come. Texas, the president's home. Lone Star State. George Bush, the president of the United States, the projected winner for re-election in the state of Texas. No surprise there. In New York, the Empire State, no surprise there. Senator Kerry, the projected winner. Here in New York, you can tell from the crowd outside here as a sample precinct that this state is fairly safe for Kerry tonight. Let's go to the next projections here. Kansas, probably the most historically Republican state in the Union. President Bush projected to win the state of Kansas. Nebraska, another Republican state historically, going back to the Civil War days. President Bush projected winner in the state of Nebraska. Rhode Island, hugely Democratic state. John Kerry's the projected winner. Heavily Catholic state, by the way. We'll talk about that religious issue later tonight, tomorrow morning. South Dakota, President Bush, the big winner there, the projected winner. That may have an influence, of course, the coattails there on the Senate race involving the incumbent Democratic leader Tom Daschle. Let's go to North Dakota. No surprise there, President Bush, the projected winner in North Dakota. These plain states are very, very traditionally Republican. Let's go to Wyoming, another state out in the West. George Bush, the projected winner, the incumbent president, projected as the winner in the state of Wyoming. Let's go right now. Too close to call. Well, this one was talked about a lot in the last couple of weeks. Colorado, it looks like a real fight out there, at least in this early going after the polls have just closed in Colorado. Too close to call. Familiar pattern tonight. Too close to call in New Mexico. Every state, by the way, we've identified as a battleground state for the last couple of weeks is having a tough time deciding today who to pick as the next president. Michigan, too early to call. That simply means we don't have enough votes in. It doesn't mean it's going to be close, but it could. You never know. Michigan has been targeted by the Republicans this time. Minnesota, another state, too early to call. That simply means we don't have enough numbers, enough ballots to look at, enough sample precincts to look at that correspond with the exit polls. Too early to call. Also in Wisconsin, a little bit unsatisfactory at this point in the evening. We're not getting what we want, which is some results in these states. Too early to call in Arizona. Simply means we don't have enough votes to count. In Louisiana, too early to call. Again, too early to call. In Florida, too close to call, which means something else entirely. 40% of the vote counted there so far in Florida. It's moving ahead steadily, and it's too close to call. We had a vote difference there on the board of about 400,000. Apparently, it's closer than that in terms of what is being projected. Too close to call in the state of Florida. Ohio, too close to call. All the biggies, we want to find out what happened. We want it now. Unfortunately, they're too close to decide at this point in the count who's going to win those states. Missouri, it's interesting. Too close to call there, although it may be based on early sampling, but too close to call in Missouri. That's significant, a relatively culturally conservative state. Too early to call in Pennsylvania. That doesn't mean much. It means too early to call. I don't know what the cheering's about outside. It's too early to call in Pennsylvania. It's too early to call in Arkansas, where President Clinton, former president, campaigned for John Kerry this past week. Too early to call in New Hampshire. Too early to call in Mississippi in the presidential race there. Of course, that's a fairly reliable Republican state. So take a look. Look at how it's filling out here. The President of the United States projected to win 156 electoral votes, with 27 votes reporting right now in our projections, included in our projections, 112 for Kerry. So the president has taken something of a lead in the 27 states where we've made projections at NBC. It is starting to fill out that continental United States, and we're still have to hear from Hawaii and Alaska. Let's take a look at the U.S. Senate races. No surprise here. Incumbent one-term Senator Chuck Schumer, re-elected to the U.S. Senate. He may run for governor, many people think. John McCain, one of the regulars, it's fair to say, on hardball. Many a night we've shared with him. Projected winner, John McCain, according to that check mark there in Arizona. Let's take a look at Wisconsin. Russ Feingold, his partner, that was the McCain-Feingold campaign reform bill. Democrat Russ Feingold checked off here as a projected winner by NBC in the state of Wisconsin. Sam Brownback, no surprise here, a culturally conservative Republican in the culturally conservative state of Kansas, the projected winner. Byron Dorgan, Democrat from North Dakota, projected winner by NBC in North Dakota. Strong incumbent there. Blanche Lincoln, Democrat in Arkansas, projected winner there. Looks rather handily to be reelected there. So that's how it stands right now. Let's take a look at the race. Too close to call. Very interesting. South Dakota, this is the Senate race everyone's going to be watching throughout the night and tomorrow morning into the newspaper writing of tonight. Tom Daschle in a very close race for re-election. Too early to call in Colorado. Pete Coors against Ken Salazar, the state's attorney general, the Democrat. The extremely well-known Mr. Coors in a close race. Too early to call in Louisiana. That's a race where you have to win 50% of the vote to avoid a runoff there. David Vitter is the Republican. Let's go right now. Too close to call in Florida. That persists, that closeness between Mel Martinez, the former HUD secretary, but with 40% of the vote counted. Too close to call. Look at this one. Hold on this one. 85% of the vote counted in Kentucky, the bluegrass state. And Jim Bunning, who everybody knows in that state, for better or worse, maybe for worse at some point tonight, 85% of that vote counted. And this extremely well-known Republican incumbent is battling for his career. Look at those numbers: 4,000 votes separating those two candidates. Too close to call in North Carolina. Much smaller vote count so far. They're just 17%, with 25,000 votes separating them. That's the precincts. That's 17% of the precincts in there. Let's talk about that race. Is going to be part of this evening's story. Of course, too close to call. This is another fascinating story. Inez Tannenbaum, the Democrat, who has bought into a lot of Republican positions on foreign and domestic issues, battling away there at 37% of the vote. Precincts, I guess, counted there, and she is battling away. Pennsylvania, a real stunner. Too close to call. Joe Hoffel, the underfunded Democratic candidate, battling away the veteran and professional politician, Arlen Specter. Let's go right now to someone very much involved in this campaign, Vanessa Carey, the daughter of the Democratic nominee. Oh, there you are. Where are you, Vanessa?
I am in the Copley Plaza Hotel in Boston. No, we are right in basically Copley Square.
Okay, let me ask you about your feelings. You've looked at, we can't talk about them, but you've probably seen them through your various networks and friends within the campaign. Looking at everything you know, how do you feel?
I feel very optimistic, but I am somebody who knocks on wood and sort of stays mum until it's really over. It's, I don't know, it's just the way I am. But I feel good, and I'm hoping everybody's going to get out to the polls. Everybody's going to vote. And every vote will be counted, because this election is too important and there's so much at stake. So I'm just going to keep watching.
I notice a bit of unusual jauntiness on the part of your father. What do you make of that?
An unusual, I'm sorry, I missed it.
It's jauntiness.
Oh.
He seems unusually jaunty these days.
Dad. That is my dad. I mean, the dad I grew up with is a very goofy, silly guy who very much, like, the image I have of my father is with his head thrown back, hand on his chest, just laughing. And that's who he is. And I think what's happening is that as the camera lens gets trained on him more and more and people are scrutinizing his every minute, they're seeing that side of him that is very jovial and very alive and very just having a good time, and that's who he is. But when he's talking about what's happening in the world, when he's talking about what's happening in Afghanistan and Iraq, when he's talking about the rising healthcare costs, when he's talking about underfunding of education, he's going to be serious, because it is serious stuff, and it's very, it deserves respect.
Vanessa, a lot of people have criticized the president in print. You've read the New York Times magazine stories and others that suggest perhaps a hint of a messianic sense on his part that he was called to this in some sort of religious way to be president. And yet there's a sort of an interesting thing I've noticed with your father, and I've noted this with you before on television. Oh, more than a year ago, he'd come to do our show on Hardball, and out in the hallway we'd exchange courtesies and say hi, and he'd say things like, "Chris, I'm going to win this one." Because I'm as skeptical as anybody else watching these candidates come and go, and people who are hopeful and then lose elections or whatever things happen. And then a couple of months ago, he did it again. He said, "I'm going to win this thing. Believe me." What's that about?
You know, it's about fighting for what you believe in. And I think, you know, I've watched my father crisscross this country, and he really feels the hopes of the American people and the desire for change. I mean, we've both encountered people who have burst into tears on us and said, "Please, get yourself elected, or get your father elected because I want to go to college," or "Please." You know, when you feel that energy, when you see these stories, when you see what people are counting on you for, it gives you a huge amount of energy, and I think a real sense that you have to fight for what you believe in. You know, I think the one thing people can say about my father is that he has fought hard, He has fought incredible battles in this, and he has continued to fight for the American people and to win this presidency. I think it's an amazing thing, and I know he will work every day in the Oval Office as hard as he has worked in this campaign. And I hope so, because I would like a leader who is going to fight that hard to defend our people and our country.
If you can be objective for just 30 or 40 seconds now, tell me why you think this president should not get a second term.
Because I think this president has had 3.5 years of making the wrong choices. If you look at the cost of health care, it's gone up. The cost of gas has gone up. If you look at the cost of education, it's gone up. The cost of college education has gone up. We have lost jobs. Jobs have gone overseas. There have been, you pick any category, and I think this president has made the wrong decisions. He's gone from a record surplus to a record deficit. Those are my future Social Security benefits on the stake. Those are my friends' Social Security benefits. He sent troops overseas without a plan for winning the peace. He has sent our troops overseas without the latest military equipment to defend them. And he has, I think, misled the American people on what the real war on terror is. Our borders are leakier today than they were 3 years ago. This list goes on and on. I think this country deserves better leadership, and I know my father can provide it.
Vanessa Carey, thank you for joining us. Maybe we'll talk to you tomorrow morning sometime as this election goes to the final results. Thank you very much for taking the time to see us tonight. Let's go right now to Keith Olbermann with a lot more results coming in from those 9 o'clock closings. Keith.
Chris, let's start with the balance of power in the Senate, where we've had a straight swap of Georgia for Illinois. The Republican seat in Illinois now goes to the Democrat Barack Obama, and the Democratic seat, at least nominally, Zell Miller's old seat, goes to the Republican Johnny Isakson. So essentially, no change in that balance of power in the new Senate. Let's run the governor's table. Some of the results here. A result now, a prediction out of North Dakota, projection that John Hoeven, the incumbent since 2001, has held off Joseph Satcham, the former state senator, in North Dakota's governor's race. Governor Mike Easley of North Carolina has been reelected, according to our NBC News projection. He's been in office since 2001, and he has defeated the former state senator Patrick Ballantyne there, so the Democrats hold North Carolina. West Virginia, with Bob Wise, the Democrat, retiring from office. His Secretary of State, Democrat Joe Manchin, will hold the state governor's mansion over the Republican Monty Warner. It is too close to call in Missouri, where the battle is between the state auditor, the Democrat Claire McCaskill, who defeated Governor Bob Holden in the primary, and Secretary of State Matt Blunt, the Republican. Too close to call, with 7% of the vote counted and an 18,000 vote actual margin difference at this point. Also too early to call in Indiana. Joe Kernan, the incumbent who took over from the late Frank O'Bannon last year, and Mitch Daniels, the former White House Office of Management and Budget Director, too early to call for governor of Indiana. Governor of Vermont, with the 7 p.m. closure, still too early to call, a 50% rule in effect here. The mayor of Burlington, Peter Clavelle, the Democrat, challenging the Republican Jim Douglas there. And one more in the Northeast out of our 11 governor's races in New Hampshire, also too early to call, where Governor Craig Benson is being challenged by the Democratic businessman John Lynch. Let's give you two House decisions for the first time tonight. In the celebrity congressman race in Kentucky, Nick Clooney, the former Los Angeles and Cincinnati newscaster, and perhaps better known because of his sister, the late Rosemary Clooney, the singer, and his son, George Clooney, the actor, is projected as having gone down to defeat to the Republican Jeff Davis in District 4 of Kentucky. And one other note from North Carolina, yet too early to call here, where Robin Hayes, the incumbent Republican, is being challenged by Beth Troutman. The name may not sound familiar, but part of her resume would. She was a producer and staffer on a television show called The West Wing. So far, at least, though, the transition from fictional politics to the real thing not going too well for her. Two calls to make on ballot propositions in the state ballots. Teen pregnancy in Florida. It bears a little explanation. Teen pregnancy has not been approved in Florida. This would be Amendment 1, which would ask voters to limit the privacy rights of teens so that a future legislature could pass a law requiring that parents be notified when their minor daughters seek an abortion. One other to make, we said that there are 11 of these ballots, 11 of these amendments or processes on the ballots across the country. And in Oklahoma, the projection is that the definition of marriage between a man and a woman, question 711, will pass in Oklahoma. So that's the table of the other results. Chris Matthews, back to you in Democracy Plaza.
Thank you, Keith Olbermann. You have lightened my heart one more time. Thank you for, I don't know where you find those interesting races, but thank you very much. Let's go right now to a real pro on the Democratic side, Mike McCurry, who has been serving as a senior advisor and spokesman. Mike, you old classy fellow, you. When you joined the campaign, what was it? How long ago was it when you joined the campaign for John Kerry?
It was 6 weeks ago, Chris. It was right after Labor Day, and I came on in September because I was determined to try to help John Kerry figure out how to change this country.
What happened? Why has he managed to get himself back into the running tonight, into a position where either he or the president could win tonight?
Well, a couple of things. I think a lot of the country really concluded that Senator Kerry was right when he argued that we really are on the wrong track as a nation. We need to change direction and get a fresh start, and really the same policies that President Bush has given us over the last 4 years just won't cut it today. But then the other thing, Chris, and you've been around long enough to know too, that any candidate running for office gets better and better and better. This one did. And I think he, in preparing for those debates, making the argument through 3 of those televised debates, really honed his argument down so that it really connected with the American people. And I think that's why he's doing very, very well tonight.
Had it not been for those debates, especially the first one, would your candidate be in the race right now?
It would have been much more difficult. I think that we needed to make, as any challenger to an incumbent president must, a very powerful change that we have to switch horses. And that's a hard thing to do. Remember, the country voted for George Bush 4 years ago, and to now say, you know, that probably wasn't the right decision because we didn't get to where we wanted to be as a nation. We need to change direction and hire someone new. That's a very hard thing to do psychologically. And I think Senator Kerry made that argument much more effectively as we went along throughout the fall, through those debates, and in the last several weeks of very tough campaigning. And I think his message really began to strike a true note with the American people. I think that's why we're going to be very happy tonight.
Peter Hart, who's the pollster who works along with Bill McInturff, he's a Democrat, Peter. Of course, Bill McInturff's the Republican. They put together the NBC Wall Street Journal poll every month. You know, he said when all the votes are counted tomorrow, perhaps when we're all done here, or we hopefully are done, that there's 2 words that are going to be talked about. One is Iraq and the other is the youth vote. Talk about those 2. Well, how do they work together here? We've seen a lot of state-by-state numbers, by the way, and you've seen them. Perhaps you've seen some other numbers we can't talk about that show a wide divide among young people in their 20s primarily supporting your candidate.
Well, let me start with young people. I think that one of the most refreshing things that could happen in our politics is to see unprecedented increases in voter turnout, especially among those eligible in the 18 to 25-year-old bracket. Chris, and you're an old hand yourself too, you know this. When young people vote and when they make their voice heard and when they really take charge of their own future, they force a change in the political vocabulary because candidates must talk about the future. I think George Bush's fatal mistake in this campaign was that he kept talking about the past. He kept attacking John Kerry's record. He kept looking backwards. You can't think of a single idea that he really advanced that broke through to the American people about what he would do with the second term, and young people especially saw that. Then to the grievous issue of Iraq and the argument that Senator Kerry made so effectively over and over again that we had just made so many wrong choices there, and we need really to start over and figure out how we're going to get things right there. Plot a new path forward in our diplomacy, very carefully stitch together again that kind of important transatlantic alliance that will help us deal with difficult world issues like Iraq. I think that's an argument that people instinctively knew to be true, especially when they saw the very hard things happening on the ground in Iraq. So all of that together, I think, added up for a very important and positive case for change. And of course, tonight, across the country, we're urging people to get out there. If you believe we need that kind of change, get out and vote. This thing is still not a long ways from over. We know it's very close. Many of these states have polls that are still open, and we need to have everyone go out and vote.
Speaking of those polls that are still open, there's been a lot of buzz emanating from the Democratic side that the president was planning
you guys lost.
Secret draft. You can't hear me? Well, that was my best question, darn it. Anyway, I wanted to ask about whether it'd be a draft in a Kerry administration. We'll get back to them later. Let's go right up to our opinion panelists. We're calling them Pat Buchanan, Dee Dee Meyer, and the newcomer tonight, Ron Silver. Ron, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks
you
a lot.
haven't had a chance to express yourself, your mood tonight as you watch this count.
Well, I just want to make a remark about what Mike just said. There was another very polarized election in my lifetime, which was 1968, where it was a very polarized electorate. There was a lot lot of invective on both sides. The stakes were very high, Vietnam War. And as opposed to this election, most of the youth then dropped out, tuned out. They felt if they participated in the process, they were cooperating and collaborating with a corrupt system. And this is far healthier. And I don't know if we're seeing a vibrant democracy in action tonight or we're having a national nervous breakdown. But whatever it is, it seems to be healthy. And I'm really happy we're having this election.
Let me go to Pat Buchanan. I don't see a pattern yet, do you? I'm looking at the votes coming in. Certainly the more southern, the more culturally conservative states are lining up, beginning with your home state of the Old Dominion, Virginia. They're all lining up as they're supposed to, joined by, again, as they were 4 years ago, West Virginia. Do you see any change from the election of 4 years ago so far?
No, there's not. But what we can see redeveloping, Chris, and we've talked about Florida and Ohio. Let's assume the president loses Ohio. Right now, you have said that Wisconsin's too close to call. I believe Iowa is, New Mexico is. If the president loses Ohio, 2 out of 3 of those, with the added votes he got from the census, compensates for the loss of Ohio. So the insurance policy that the president went in to get in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, New Mexico, as of now, looks like a possibility. So keep an eye on Ohio. If the president wins it, he's in extraordinary shape, obviously with Florida, but he still has an insurance policy if Ohio doesn't go well.
Let me ask you, in your Rubik's Cube, is there a point tonight when you'll throw in the towel for the Republican side?
Listen, if the president loses Florida, Chris, and wins Ohio, he's got to win Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa, but that will be enough to compensate for the loss of Florida. But Colorado, of course, comes into play. That's got 9 electoral votes, but the math is playing out here. Again, you got to begin with the president's got 278 electoral votes. Kerry has got to hold all of his votes and take 9 away from the president. He hasn't taken a single one yet.
Do you agree with all that, Didi, or do you see the same pattern working for Kerry? I mean, it seems to me you could look at the same results and say Kerry can win.
Absolutely. I think it's about Ohio, Wisconsin, as I've thought all along. If Kerry wins both Ohio and Wisconsin, yes, you can come up with an electoral sort of scotch tape together plan where the president wins, but the watermark will be so high that I think Senator Kerry will almost certainly be elected. But, Chris, I want to add one thing to what you said earlier. You said it'll be about Iraq and young voters, the story of this election. But I want to add to that the economy, because if you look at what Kerry voters are saying was the most important issue that drove them to the polls, it's the economy by a bigger margin than pollsters had picked up before people started going to the polls. And it sort of vindicates the decision of the Kerry campaign to focus so much of the senator's message in the closing days on economic issue, on jobs, on health care, and things like that. So we'll see how that plays out in the next hours and days.
Okay, we're about to give you a sense, as we've done every night, throughout the night at 23 after the hour and 53 after the hour, of how the campaign tonight, the election count, looks right now. Let's go right now to Brian Williams, who's going to give us a sense of that very complicated, balkanized state of Florida. Brian.
Well, Chris, that is what we're looking at here in our tracking center. This is, of course, the state that kept us up so late 4 years ago, despite adding 1.5 million new registered voters over the last 4 years. Again, too close to call at poll closing tonight. Both candidates worked Florida over very hard, and this is an astounding statistic. Over half of all Florida voters say they were contacted and asked to vote for one presidential candidate or the other. Both campaigns equally energetic. 37% say they were contacted by the Kerry folks, 34% by the Bush camp. Some got calls from both. Florida was, of course, one of the states where people took advantage of, early voting. Well over 1 million Floridians cast ballots before today. They say 1 in 5 votes already in before we said our first words tonight. Both groups were evenly divided between President Bush and Senator Kerry. Now, if John Kerry does manage to win Florida, it will be on the strength of first-time voters, which made up 13% of the electorate. Chris, there you have your first-time voter stat there, as they broke strongly for John Kerry by a margin of 59-40 on the first-time voters. If Bush wins Florida tonight, he may well have Mother Nature to thank. 87% of those voting said they approved of the way the federal government stepped in after that string of hurricanes that relentlessly hit the Atlantic coast of that state in August and September. Chris, back to you.
Brian, I'm impressed because we talked about it for a couple of days about the importance of the new voter, the younger voter, someone between 18 and 29. It's almost like watching a sports contest. Those are the people that play the games in this country. This pattern of almost 20%, do you sense that's going to be a decisive factor as we write the history of this election?
Well, what was weird was, Chris, I think I even heard this expressed on your broadcast last night. If you've spent any time around politics, if you've worked in it, covered it, if you just read about it, you know that every 4 years we talk about, well, the young people are truly going to come out this time. And there were a ton of skeptics because there are pros who will tell you they never do. We will see. You know, we can't talk turnout until the last dog dies, until the last vote is counted. We will see if these numbers truly come out in the wash tonight. It looks like of all the new registrants, they tend to be breaking carry in the states we've studied. We'll see what the numbers look like at the end of the evening in the wee small hours.
Brian, hold that thought. We just want to get you. We like to do these as fast as we can. We've got a call in the presidential race. Let's give it right now. In the state of Louisiana, President Bush, the projected winner according to NBC when all the votes are counted in Louisiana. George Bush will be the winner in that state. Let's go right back to Mississippi, another projected win for the president. These are not surprising. These are red states if there ever were one. Louisiana, although there was some thought, I think, early on about the possibility of Louisiana. Let's take a look now at the national map, the electoral map, which will decide the next president. Again, it takes 270 to win this thing, as we've all come to learn the hard way. 171 for the president, 112 for challenger John Kerry. And by the way, look how it's shaping up, just like it always does. Let me get back to Brian Williams, who's taking a look at the exiting comments people make. Youth, I guess, is a big issue. Have you gotten a sense of the Iraq issue, Brian?
Well, that is playing, and you know, Iraq is a double-edged sword. That is playing among certain demographics. You can guess who they are. We've looked at, as you know, just a few of the battlegrounds tonight. It is too early tonight to give any kind of judgment as to the mass population and how that issue cut. We do know among young people, a lot of the evidence anecdotal, that the kind of rumor of a draft that was put down so many times by the administration, kind of stoked on the internet, that did have an influence, especially on college campuses, those voter registration kiosks that were set up. That is responsible for some signups. But again, with fresh data coming in every few minutes tonight, with a long night ahead of us, and that'll be one of the great and interesting questions at the end of the night. How did the war in Iraq break?
Thank you, Brian. I think the world will be watching that assessment, by the way, by our pollsters of how well the people thought and how often they thought when they went to vote, how much they thought about Iraq, because the world will see this election or defeat of the president as a referendum, let's face it, on how we, the American people, support the foreign policy of this administration. It's just going to be that way, like it or not, from Rangoon to Rio de Janeiro. We're going to be talking to panel. Let's talk to the panel now. I want to ask this question. The youth vote, you've been tabulating, I've been watching you, Andrew, write down these numbers. The youth vote is breaking for Kerry, but is it showing up enough to win for him?
That's still unclear, but it's showing up in Florida and it's showing up in Pennsylvania, at least among the exit polling, if the exit polling is correct. And in Pennsylvania, we're finding that the youth vote is importantly not only Kerry, but it's importantly interested in Iraq. The people who are voting for Kerry in Pennsylvania are caring about Iraq, health care, jobs, and the economy. Not surprisingly, the people in Pennsylvania who are voting for George Bush are telling us that they were concerned about terrorism and moral values, and they separate the issue of terror from Iraq, from the Iraq war. Among Pennsylvania voters who say that Iraq was the most important issue, 75% voted for Kerry, as did 83% who said that health care and jobs.
Isn't it fascinating? It's a battle of language as much as anything else.
Really?
If you say terrorism, you're probably voting for the president. If you say Iraq, 3/4 are voting for Kerry.
And if I can remain cynical tonight about the youth vote coming out in swarms, again, we won't know, like Brian Williams said, till the very end how many came out. But I've seen image after image after image after image of voters today from Alabama to California, all across America. And I'll tell you what, they look like the same middle-aged voter to me. I'm telling you, maybe it's going to happen for the first time ever, but we're just going to have to wait and see.
The exit polling in Pennsylvania shows that more than 60% of the young voters went to Kerry.
Well, so that doesn't matter. I mean, what matters is how many of them went out. I mean, and we don't know that, as Brian Williams said. And all I'm saying is, based on anecdotal evidence and anecdotal evidence only, I saw the same. I mean, I looked into the faces of the voters, and they look like the same voters that vote in every election every 4 years. I didn't see a lot of young 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old kids in the line there.
Can we get off this for 1 second and talk about the war? Mayor, when people talk in this election, and you hear them, we've been doing this for 2 years, this election, they talk in different language. Republicans who like the president, and it's 97% of the Republicans, use the war on terrorism. The term war on terrorism. They talk about WMD. They talk about regime change. They talk about values. Democrats say jobs, jobs, jobs. They use different lingo. They also say Iraq, Iraq, Iraq. Have you heard this before, where there's different lingo?
Total and complete lingo distinctions between the various believers. I tell you this, though, I don't think that there are very many people that believe that the president has handled the war in Iraq the way it should have been handled. When you think about the numbers and you hear people react, those who believe that Iraq is part of the war on terrorism are definitely for Bush. Those who make a separation between the two are overwhelmingly for Kerry. And that's why you have so many young people that are for Kerry. They don't make the connection between the war on terrorism. They appreciate what Bush has done on terrorism, but they believe he misled the nation and the world on Iraq. And they interpret it that way. Absolutely. And all the other things that have come since then. All of the other, there's nothing worse that could have happened.
Yeah, all the things John Kerry said in 1998 about Saddam Hussein, and 2002 about Saddam Hussein, and 2003 about Saddam Hussein. Yeah.
Well, Joe, you can have all those views on Saddam Hussein, and you still may not have gone forward with the war unless there were some other factors.
I'm just talking about misleading about WMDs. I still find it funny.
I've got a question about this. Most people give President Bush some credit for
just for a second, Ron.
Sure,
we can watch while we listen to you. That's John Edwards, who was delayed. Remember, we announced a while ago in Florida to make some calls on behalf of Erskine Bowles, the man running for the United States Senate in his home state of North Carolina. He's joining now, of course, in Boston, the Democratic nominee for president, John Kerry. But it took him a while to get up there, so we're going to watch that while you talk.
Okay. Well, here's what I'm wondering, and it's really more of a question. Most people, as I was saying, give Mr. Bush a lot of credit for the so-called war on terror. A lot of people are very nervous about the war on Iraq. What does it mean that the Bush-Cheney team has combined those two issues? Is it an advantage to them when, from their perspective, they're the same thing if so many people are divided themselves about it?
But the American people, if you look at the Washington Post poll that I know everybody was familiar about a year and a half ago, the Washington Post poll showed that the American people a year and a half ago were merging those two together. As we moved closer to this election, of course, it started breaking up. They'd separate 20% Iraq, 20% on the war on terror.
The exit polling that we're reporting tonight shows that 52%, so a majority, believes that Iraq is part of the war on terror. 45% think that it's separate. And there was a direct split of 48-48 on whether the war was being handled well
Which drives Democrats and drives the Kerry campaign and always has driven them crazy. That
shows how smart it was for the Bush campaign.
That the American people put Iraq and the war on terror together.
By the way, the youth vote in Florida, according to the exit polling at least, was 13%, which is double what it was.
You all keep talking about the youth vote. We'll talk tomorrow.
Excuse me, it's a little less.
We don't know if it's enough.
We don't know if it's enough.
But it is significant that there's such a split, almost 60-40 in every state we've looked at. That is a national pattern, whatever it could be minuscule in its importance. We're going to have to see how many young people voted right now.
And I think it is college tuitions, it's economic issues as much as it is the war. And it's a worry about Social Security. Interestingly, the 65 and over vote is going to George Bush, according to the exit polling. The Democrats did not make Social Security a big, third-rail issue this year and did not scare the old people.
Well, let's take a break now and get some update. Let's get some numbers from Keith Olbermann as we watch this dramatic arrival in Beantown of John Edwards. That's probably getting ready to come off. But let's go to Keith Olbermann for some hot news. Keith.
All right, Chris, Senator Edwards' former home, the Senate not being significantly altered tonight, as we've been mentioning, a swap, essentially, the Republican seat in Illinois for the Georgia Democratic seat with what will be Senator-elect Isaacson of Georgia now taking it for the Republicans, and Illinois' Senator-elect Obama, soon to be so described right now, still projections from NBC News. We wanted to give you some update on the House of Representatives as well, where the two key members, as you see, Senator Edwards, Vice Presidential Democratic candidate Edwards, arriving in Boston to join up with Senator Kerry as they await the presidential election results and the continuing calling of the states, which Chris and company will be carrying. Senator Edwards is successfully managing to get off the plane without incident and past a couple of cars and into an SUV.
Okay, Keith, thank you for that report. We were watching John Edwards, of course, arrive in Boston. He looks as good as he always looks. We'll see how big a role he played in this final decision. Let's come back and talk. We're going to be back with Nora O'Donnell and others. We're going to get back right here in a moment. Stay with us on MSNBC at Democracy Plaza.